Welcome, everybody. Let's see. Now we are only 3 weeks from final exams. So obviously we're down to the last few new topics, and we will have probably a whole class to do the review. That would be the class prior. Well, I guess a whole class, at least an hour and a half. To do the review. You want to be here for that. That would be, as you, if you could take a look on your syllabus, on the 16th, 2 weeks from tonight, we'll have to finish Gothic, so that'll leave us the second half. But that's always enough because remember, you have an open book exam policy that's inevitable, of course, with an online class. Let me do the speaker view here. And also, you obviously can bring notes or whatever other materials you want that you're going to have beside you when you take the test. But we'll get to that 2 weeks from tonight. We'll do the review. So since we have several new topics to discuss, we're probably not going to end early again. Well, a little bit. It could be 10 minutes or even 15 occasionally. But just if you look down the list, the number of slides we have is, for instance, tonight we have 2 topics. So I doubt we'll end early tonight, maybe 5 minutes. We'll see. I'd like to. So it'll be up to how many questions people have and, things you want me to either repeat, restate if it's not clear, but hopefully that won't be too many. Okay, but I have 2 announcements. Well, one is more just I call it a house cleaning thing, and that is, it's getting late enough in the semester. I think it's okay for me to mention, for the sake of those students who might still be in the category, which by any means you won't be alone if you are. But in all my classes, there's 2 or 3 people on average this late in the semester that might not have yet gotten in their first paper and yet are still registered. And I would urge you to do both your first. And if you turned your second paper in, good for you, because it would have been on time. But the first paper is only 10 points off. It doesn't go up, but you don't want to wait till right before final exams in my class and any other classes you have to be writing a paper. So just a heads up, there's only, I think it's a couple people in this class. Let's see, Cara Boughton and Matilda Mays. I haven't yet received the first paper, and I am awaiting my readers returning of some of the second papers, all the ones that were turned in on time. I should have them by Wednesday, but I can't guarantee I get the grades out to you by then. So if you turned your paper in on time and you got your grade back, it's because it's from one of the readers who was able to return them sooner. I usually prefer waiting till all the on-time papers grades have been given to me to send them all out at the same time. But then it's getting too late in the semester to go back, you know what I mean, to worry about missing, everyone and or otherwise having to rush like 30 grades out all at once by internet, and also to make sure you got your grade. So if you didn't get your grade, it's because your paper is still, or your second paper, but is still with one of the readers who has her own full plate, like all of us do, full class and working at Trader Joe's. She's been doing it for me for years, totally reliable. So I should have them when I meet her on Wednesday. She's going to email them to me. And that's, of course, when I meet her to double check. I always read over. I think I've said this. I don't just enter the grades, willy-nilly. I double check my readers' work to make sure they overlook something or miscalculate isn't the word, I guess, misadd, incorrectly add points. I mean, it happens occasionally. So then I enter them in my roll book, and then I send the grades out to each of the students who turn their papers in on time. If they're late, sometimes that takes me a little longer. Well, usually does. All right. So that's just sort of house cleaning. But this is the more, I think the word is interesting and exciting. I hope it is for some of you. New fact or option, I should say. Whoop, there goes almost my light. Almost fell off my desk. Hang on. Vicariously purchased. All right. And that is extra credit option that I haven't done it in 3 years because we couldn't. It wasn't safe. Obviously, the pandemic caused all kinds of live events to be canceled. One of mine had already 150 people signed up to go to a Maybach, Bernard Maybach, one of the world's great architects that you probably never heard of. But at some point in this class, you could find out more about him. He's the first green architect. And he started the idea of nature-based design. Without him, there wouldn't be a UC Berkeley architecture department, one of the world's great architecture schools. He founded it. There probably wouldn't have a green architecture movement. He didn't call it that because that wasn't the term then. It was nature-based design. Same concept in 1890. He was practicing that. And it wouldn't have been the first woman architect, independent woman architect in American history, probably, Julia Morgan, who's even much more famous now than he was. He was her teacher at Berkeley. So his work is astounding. When you see it, you'll see what I mean if you choose to come on a walking tour. I am going to go ahead with a walking tour. I've already made the arrangements with most. There's one building I'm waiting to hear back about access to. But I walked the route and I knocked on doors. I had one of my teaching assistants come along who actually won't be able to come on the tour because she has to work. It's on Sunday, this semester's extra credit optional walking tour. It's worth 20 points, the most of any option, because it means, you would of course be coming to Berkeley because we're going to meet in Berkeley. And this should be our first interior that we see. Now, the way the screen is reflecting, I think it's better if I hold it slightly. There we go. That's a little better. This is the book I wrote on Maybach, who, as I just said, is one of the least known important architects, and it shouldn't be that way. It's the Bay Area is where he was born. No, he was born in New York. Sorry, I meant to say he has spent his whole adult life, or well, his whole career, professional career, in the Bay Area. His offices were in Berkeley and San Francisco. This is the church that is a National Historic Landmark that is in Berkeley, South Campus. That's the area we're going to take the tour of, that we hope to be able to start with, and I'm 90% certain we will, because the people who allow groups of visitors to come in have to have everything approved. I mean, these days, lawyers, so they have this kind of thing they have to go through. It's a whole process. It's committee, everything's by committee anymore. No one makes decisions on their own. So once their committee meets, and I just talked to the head of the commission, I have no reason why we wouldn't allow your group to come in, because you've always had a great group of students and others. You don't have to be a student if you want to invite a guest. They don't have to be a student at the JC to join the tour if they'd like. But anyway, the point is that this will be Sunday, May 22nd. You'll get an email next week. It won't be probably in time for this class for me to announce it online at the live Zoom class, but certainly no later than Thursday or Friday next week with all the details. But I'm just giving you a heads up. It's from 2 to 4:30, and it's the best day of the week is Sunday because there's no parking issues. Well, there's no meter enforcement. Okay, so you don't have to worry about feeding your meter. Wherever you park, you can leave your car and not worry about getting a ticket. And then we're going to go in after the church. It should be our first interior. That alone is worth the trip. It's spectacular. In fact, it right now is in the process. That church group is in the process of trying to get it approved for a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Not too many buildings are in each country. Only a handful of buildings are of that importance. I think it well deserves it, and I think I signed some kind of thing about it from me and a bunch of other professors that know about it, and obviously have done research on his work. Anyway, it's his most important building, and you probably never heard of it. You've all heard of the Palace of Fine Arts, though, right? In San Francisco, every movie, every rom-com, every TV series ever filmed in San Francisco, they have a scene set right next to the Palace of Fine Arts with the lagoon and the ducks and the people getting married. And, it's such a popular site. He designed that. And that's the only building most people would know of his work. And it's so different than the church, but it's also equally beautiful. But that you can go to see on your own, of course, if you want to go into San Francisco and take pictures. And on this tour, you can bring a camera and you can take pictures as long as there's no flash. For a twofer, right? I mean, you get 20 points for attending as long as you stay for the whole tour. Don't just show up and disappear. I'll have an assistant who will take people's names and register you in and take your fees. It's $20 a person, whether you're a student or not. Because again, I'm not being paid to do these. It's a lot of work, but it's worthwhile because you'll see things you never otherwise would have access to. We'll go into another building. I just got a call confirming this. That's designed by Julia Morgan. America's first independent woman architect. They did Hearst Castle. It's a co-op now, but it's a well-run one. And then also a fraternity, and I won't go into too much detail because I'll give you more information, say, after it's 100% confirmed which buildings are going in. But this one is, of all things, a fraternity where the people take care of the building and don't allow, messes and vandalism and trash to. Yes, it's a fraternity that honors the history of the building they're in. And it's this really wonderful house. It's a National Historic Landmark too. It's from 1908, 3-story craftsman style house by the top craftsman firm in the United States. They were out of Pasadena. You ever seen the movie, the original Back to the Future? I don't think the sequels used it, but one of those, that two brothers, the Green and Green were brothers, designed the house that Doc, the character Doc, lives in that first Back to the Future. And so you've seen it if you watch that movie. Their work I'm talking about. Well, this is just as beautiful, if not more so, because the professor who had it built was the head of the forestry department in 1908. There's nothing like it else anywhere in the Bay Area. So that's another site. And then we'll end with the faculty club. So I know we get to our slides. I know we got to get going, but the faculty club is totally unique. Again, I've been to faculty clubs. I've sat in them. I've been invited, or otherwise just was allowed, public sometimes allowed in on all kinds of, Stanford and Cal State colleges, when I was taking my master's or teaching at Sonoma State and SF State, I would join the faculty, and they're some of them are nice and they're interesting, but this is unique. There's no other place like it. It's a whole complex attached of 1902, the part Maybeck design, and that's a historic landmark too. And they don't usually allow people in there unless you're invited by a faculty member or you rent the place for a wedding. But I have worked on that so many years. They know my book, and so yes, they're going to allow us to have access. So it should be a fun afternoon. You'll learn a lot. You get 20 points. You can take a photo of any one of the buildings and turn that into another 10-point extra credit option if you choose. All right, you'll get an email confirming the details late next week. All right, any questions before we start? I always do that about anything. The extra credit options you may or may not have yet. Nobody's done all of them, I don't think, or grades. Okay, or not, because again, I'll stick around at the end. All right, let's do our first must know, because the first topic is because we started late, we're kind of playing a slight catch-up type thing. All right, because we have to cover 17 weeks worth of slides with 15 weeks. All right, so this is an important slide, so you all want to make sure you take good notes on it. Because it has a very high, I would even say, probability of appearing on either the slide identification or slide as a part of the final. Okay, so it's our first must know. It's purse cover, just like it sounds, purse cover from Sutton Hoo, Sutton, second word, HOO. I can get it out of my head that a student of mine about 15 years ago, when I was showing this in an in-person class, said, Sutton Hoo, that sounds like the title of a Dr. Seuss book. Yeah, it does, but it's a town in southern England. And this particular piece, which I didn't give you the location, is England. I'm sorry. 630. By the way, all the dates from now on are Common Era or CE or 80. So you don't have to worry about the letters. So 630, well, that's the Dark Ages. There's no other way to put it. It's early medieval. That's our topic for the first half of tonight, of course. So what does that tell us? Well, this was a period of ignorance, violence, and superstition, quite literally, throughout Europe, all of Europe. And in England, it was no different. There was all kinds of warfare and warlords attacking each other, but there wasn't a kingdom in the southern part of what's now England. And that's where this was created for the king of that kingdom. And he was a Saxon, Saxon, and that would mean that he was Celtic. So Celtic, Celtic, would mean someone with the heritage of the Celtic culture, which is still around. There's still people who speak, millions of people in Europe speak Celtic. I think it's even taught in some universities. Those are the four precursors to the Romans. When the Romans came in, they took over everything, but they didn't wipe out the Celts. They couldn't, there were too many. So the Celts survived. They had been there for thousands of years before the Romans. They survived under Roman rule, and then they emerged after Rome fell to found their own kingdoms. And one of them was the Saxon Kingdom of England. You could just say England, the Kingdom of England, which is where most of today, southern half of, or most of, 2/3 of this island of Great Britain, the southern part, is the modern portion of Great Britain that we call England. I think everyone knows England and Great Britain. One's a country, the other's a region. England is a region, not a country. It's part of Great Britain. So this was from that area which had its own king, and it was the king's personal belonging. And he kept in this is the main part of the meaning, 3 kinds of valuable things. A purse, yes, real kings carried purses. Fanny pack, if you prefer, is a phrase that might be more, commonly known today. It was something that he would take with him whenever he traveled outside of his own castle to other parts of his kingdom. So what would he keep in this that it was so valuable that he would take it with him? His best or finest, you could say, most valuable jewelry would be the first thing. His fanciest and most valuable jewelry. The second thing would be documents, letters, and treaties, all kinds of written documents, because very few people could read and write. The kings usually could, and had a few people working with them who could. So those written documents, letters, whatever, private documents that no one else should see except who the king wants to see, that he would leave behind in the castle when he left. So the important and private documents and letters were the second category of things that this fanny pack or purse would contain. And the third thing is a signature ring. Now, some of you might know what this is from all that. I have never watched any of those, medieval things on TV, just too busy. But you've seen, some of you, a king in the Middle Ages, or even right up through until the 1800s, would have a special ring with their, it's not a signature, it's signet. It's just their initials or symbol with their initials that proves it was the king that was sealing that document. Of course, they did that with hot wax, and then they pushed the ring into the wax. And once it's cools, that secures that document, keeps it, sealed until the person intended to receive it can open it. So once again, you don't have to get too detailed, but you could say he keep his signature rings is the symbol in this. And he had more than one usually, with different meanings, with different symbols for different kinds of documents. So those 3 kinds of things are what would have been carried in this. But then we get to our first new term of tonight, and that is animal style. This is a classic example of that style, and so we need to define it at this point. So if you take out your list of terms to know, let me see, did I not include that? I hope I did. Let's see, I'm pretty sure I did. Yeah, yes, it's there. Animal style, medieval. Why do I put medieval? Because it was a previous use of that term, and it's totally different. The ancient version of animal style is not the same thing. So this is the definition that might appear on the true false section of the final. So here we go, animal style. It's a style of medieval art, in which animals were used to depict the strength. It's a short definition, to depict the strength and power of the ruling classes. Again, it's a style of medieval art, in which animals were used to depict the strength and power of the ruling classes. It was a political statement, is what it was in imagery. So here we have really classic examples of that animal style, medieval version. We'll start with this. I think most of you have noticed, if you've been looking at this closely, that these are 2 sets of birds, one of which is a bird of prey scooping the brains out of the weaker bird. Well, that says it all right there. If it's not obvious, you want to write this. The larger bird, the bird of prey, represents the king and or the ruling classes in general, but specifically this is his bag. So it's him, the king, can do whatever the heck he wants to any other citizen of his, well, they wouldn't be citizens, you could say subject, that's what they call them, subject or resident of his kingdom. They had no limits. Their power was ultimate and absolute, as you probably know from just basic history, right? So the ruling classes in general and the king specifically could get away with whatever they felt like. And we see examples of that in certain parts of the world today, don't we? So what we see here is the king symbolized by the bird of prey devouring whatever enemy he chose to kill, right? Symbolized by the captured bird there that's obviously about to get eaten. Okay, then the other symbols on the side here, let's move this over, keep the larger view, is some poor poacher who's been trapped by the king's dogs, guard dogs, you could say, or hunting dogs. This would be hunting dogs. The hunting dogs are about to devour this man because he committed one of the ultimate crimes. He's tried to hunt, maybe he was trying to feed his family, doesn't matter what the reason. He poached on the king's hunting grounds or grounds, however you want to say it, the king's lands. And that's a capital offense. If you, in the Middle Ages, you did that, or even later on into the Renaissance, the king could have you executed, no questions asked, no trial. So he set his dogs on this, poacher. That's the only word for it, poachers, right? I guess they're still poachers today, but back then it was a deadly crime, a lethal crime. You could be punished with death. And the king, in this case, chose to just set his dogs on the man. You could see by the look on his face, he knows he's about to go to the great hunting ground in the sky. So he's about to be devoured by the king's hunting dogs. And the same over here. So you have these two sets of the same types of symbols, which are examples, of course, of the animal style. And then the final examples up here, these are dragons. Funny looking, maybe to most of us, we think of dragons as much heavier, thicker bodies, maybe even with wings. But this was medieval version of what a dragon could look like. Dragons have always symbolized in every culture that uses them, and every continent has used symbols of dragons except Australia. I don't think the Aboriginal tribes did, but all the other cultures that we've covered in this class, in the ancient world and throughout the Middle Ages and even into the Renaissance, so for just thousands of years, the dragon symbolizes the ruling classes. It symbolizes those with the power. And so again, those dragons intertwined as they are 2 by 2 are symbolic of the power, again, of the ruling classes, in this case, the king specifically. Okay, so a couple of you may have thought about this. I showed the slide last week to my other class. It's covering the same material. Somebody asked, what's this? Is this original? No, that's the museum in the museum exhibit case. They had to put something behind these pieces of, guess what, this is part of the meaning, the last part of the meaning. What looks like gold, yeah, it is. It's solid gold. Everything that's gold is gold. Everything that's got that color. And then we have precious stones, 2 kinds. So there are 3 materials, and we'll do the formal analysis in just a moment. We have garnet, right, the red stone, and lapis lazuli. If you recall, they were popular stones, well, especially lapis lazuli for the ancient Egyptian jewelry and funeral art. So we have 2 kinds of precious stone, and then this is the museum's backing. It's probably enamel, but that would have been originally almost certainly, hey, being a purse, it would have been leather, probably, almost certainly would have been leather. And of course, it was in the ground for what, 14 centuries? Well, I didn't say that. The last thing you could put in, if you want to, on the meaning. This was found during the 1930s, or you could say just before World War II, by an amateur archaeologist. He discovered hundreds of relics from early Saxon England, and this king's burial site was one of them. So that's how this was found, by an amateur who shouldn't have been able to figure out even where these things were, let alone how to get them out of the ground. But he did. He got them safely out, and they went to the British Museum. And that's the museum that owns them, displays them, and has put this white enamel, I think it's enamel, as a backing. But that's not original. That's just from the museum display. Okay, let's do a formal analysis. Is this balanced? Oh, yes, absolutely. Totally. And that's the most amazing thing to me about this. Well, there are 2 things. Considering how far back this is, these are Celtic artists. And you can say this about, we're going to see a bunch of Celtic art here in the next 3 or so slides. The Celts were master metal workers and woodworkers. They were superb craftsmen in metal and wood working. And that shows here. This is quite skilled. I mean, yeah, it's all done by hand, and there's no master mold or anything. Each piece was done separately, but they managed to make them look almost identical. In fact, I've actually had a couple of students write papers on this over the years who say some historians believe they must have had some kind of a pattern or a mold. No, they didn't. We know that. We know how they worked with metal. They just did it freehand. It's pretty amazing when you look at it, that they got this almost totally identical imagery left to right, obviously, and also top to bottom, because the number of pieces, the weight of them, the area covered is about equal. So then the mass of it is, there's no larger or smaller mass to me. It's all pretty much equal. And some people think this group of these two birds side by side is larger than this, but it's really hard to say that. So I would say they're almost all equal masses on these different metal figures or decorations, if you prefer to call that. So there really isn't a larger or smaller mass here, I wouldn't say. There is only one technique for space, overlapping. These birds, obviously, the birds of prey overlap the weaker birds. And then these dogs, their paws or claws, I guess, whatever, are overlapping this poor, soon to die poacher. And then these dragons overlap each other's bodies. So there's only overlapping. There's no modeling, but there is simulated texture. It's so well done that when you look at it, the closer you get, the more you notice that's really quite well done for being done in metal, and well over 13 centuries ago, when they didn't have the fine tools that we have today. And I'd say there's some texture on at least the hair and the collars of the dogs on this group of figures here. Not up above. It's just decorative patterns. So there's some simulated texture, but no modeling. The lines are almost all bold. I don't really see any thin lines here everywhere around all of the decorations, and of course the border. The colors, of course, again, ignore the white. That's not part of this original. Are warm on the, you can just say red stone, but it's garnet, and on the gold. So it's mostly warm, but there is the cool blue color of lapis lazuli. And of course, the textures are real or simulated. Well, I would say they're simulated, as I said, on the feathers and the hair and collars here, but there's the real smooth texture of gold and precious stones. So there's both real and simulated textures. It's totally dynamic. I don't see a single straight line in it. And obviously the rhythm is powerful with the same shapes, as I've just mentioned, the repeated shapes of the animals and human figures, the dragons. And let's see, modeling, balance, rhythm. I already mentioned space, the only technique. Oh, by the way, if you want to talk about the real space, this is about 10 inches wide and about 8 inches tall. But there is the technique I already said of overlapping. By the way, if you ever go to the British Museum, a word to the wise, don't do what I did. I was teaching already, it's been several years after I started teaching at the JC, this same course. And I just had to get a close-up look at these feathers to see how detailed the texture was on the metalwork. And I leaned towards my head down towards the glass case to get a better look. And suddenly an alarm went off, and the guard walked over and said, "Step away from the case." So they don't like people getting close. This is insured for something like upwards of $100 million. It's that irreplaceable and valuable. I read that somewhere. There's nothing quite like it. To find an intact piece like this is remarkable. And the guy that found it didn't ask for a penny. He could have sold these on the open market, and instead he gave it to his own country, to the British Museum. All right, this is the next must know. This one is a much simpler one to describe the meaning. Stag staff from Sutton Hoo. We already spelled Sutton Hoo, same town, same burial site. In fact, the same archaeologist found this in the 1930s in southern England. So stag staff, S-T-A-F-F, of course, from Sutton Hoo, England, same year, 630 AD. So this is from that same Saxon king of the early kingdom of England, when the Celts were the dominant culture. In fact, they were the culture there. I don't know if there were a few other probably non-Celts living in that kingdom, but the king was definitely Celtic. And so he hired someone to make this. Is it a staff? Well, what is a staff? And I don't think, there it is. It's on our list of terms to know. It's not a long definition. Okay. A staff is a long, narrow wooden or metal stick, often decorated with an end piece, comma, that's what we're looking at, the end piece, often decorated with an end piece, comma, which symbolizes the authority of the king or queen. You don't want to say ruler because that could mean, any local ruler. It would only be a king or queen who would carry a staff. And those are still big. If you ever see Queen Elizabeth, my goodness, she's going to make it past 100. Was she 97 now? The second, right? The one that's officially, really just a figurehead, right? In England. At this point, if you don't know this, she has a staff that's been around for centuries that her ancestors used whenever they were on the throne. Whenever she's in public, sitting on the throne itself, not everywhere she goes, but that would be too cumbersome. But when she officially has an audience, any audience that a king or queen would have, all the way back to ancient Roman emperors, it goes that far back, thousands of years, all the way up until today, a king or queen would hold the staff and usually rested on the arm of their throne, of course. But this is the end piece, of course, the decorative end piece. And it's a stag, which I think most everyone knows is the alpha male, right? Or therefore what the dominant, right, member of what are a group of deer called? I don't even know. A herd, isn't it? A herd? I don't know. Anyway, any group of deer has to have a dominant member, and that would be the stag. And of course, it should be pretty clear, but if not, you would want to write this, that this symbolizes the fact that that's who the king is in his own kingdom. He is the dominant or alpha male. By the way, England has had, as you know, I'm sure, several female rulers, queens, who had power, real power, not just Elizabeth I or Queen Victoria, but there were a couple others too. And there's not too many parts of the medieval kingdoms in Europe that have had at least, even the Russians have had at least one or two female rulers. We're one of the few major countries in the world that's never had a female leader. Something to think about. So what we have is the piece at the end of a staff. The staff would have joined or been attached by a metal clamp. It would have to have been. That's the only thing that would work, because this is a piece of bone. This is made out of a carved piece of bone about 5 inches tall. So the staff, which is usually about 2 feet long, most staffs are about that, 18 inches to 2 feet, but it's just a long, narrow stick is all you have to do. They might need me repeat that definition I gave just a moment ago. Okay, because it may come up on the true false section of the final. Anyway, so originally it was a piece attached at the end of the staff, and the antlers would face outward towards whoever was standing in front of the king or queen, in this case, the king. One other fact about the meaning before we do a formal analysis. Can anybody think of any other purpose that this kind of a item attached to a stick with the horns or antlers, I guess is the right word, antlers sticking outward? What else could a king possibly do with a staff if he chose to, that had this kind of a sharp decoration? Anybody think of any idea?
To hit them?
Yeah, say it again. Go ahead. Go ahead. Yeah, I think you said hit someone with it, right? Yes, it was done. Oh yeah, more than a few times. Not most kings would. Well, I can't say that. All I know is that it wasn't the normal purpose or typical use of it, but it was acceptable. Remember, we covered the fact that kings had no limits on their power back then. In fact, they continued to think like that right up until the French Revolution, right, in the 1700s. Then some of them realized maybe we ought to start listening to some of our own people. But all the way through the Middle Ages, kings had total power to do whatever they wanted. So, with some limitations. If a whole bunch of nobles organized against them, they might have to, change the course. But in this period, that wouldn't have happened. So if this king wanted to, he could take this end piece of this staff, hit anyone he wanted across the face of the head, and kill them, even if they actually were hit hard enough, he could kill someone and there'd be no consequences. So it could be, in other words, it could be used as a weapon. And that is only, let's just say rare or unusual occasions, but we know it has happened or did happen. And I'll give you one example. You have to write this now, which is Ivan the Terrible. As some of you may know, Ivan the Terrible, the um, Tsar of Russia in the 1500s, which in Russia, the 1500s was the Dark Ages, basically. They were several centuries behind Western Europe in their cultural development. At least honest Russian historians, I know quite a few when I traveled to the country 5 times, right? Will tell you that we were in the Dark Ages when he was the Tsar. He was cruel, bloodthirsty, violent, short-tempered. He killed his own son, if you can believe it, with his own staff in front of a room full of people in the Kremlin. Yes, the Kremlin was already built by then. In some, the throne room, I assume, of the Kremlin. Actually, I've been in that room. And so why? Because his son wanted, you have to write this, the son wanted to just have privacy on his wedding night or shortly after he married his lovely new wife. So, he could start having his married life. And instead, his father, the Tsar, Ivan the Terrible, insisted that his son let him sleep with his son's wife. Well, his son said no. And immediately his father, the Tsar, Ivan the Terrible, struck his son as hard as he could across the temple with his staff. And his son bled to death within a few seconds or maybe a minute in his own arms. He actually regretted it soon after he did it, but it was too late. And nothing happened to that Tsar because he had total power. So these things could be used as weapons, whether, deliberately or accidentally. They could kill someone, and no one would be able to punish the king if that happened. All right, that's plenty on the meaning. And so let's do a formal analysis. Now, this is actually a warm color, but the slide, I don't know why, but when I've looked on the internet several times, and I was looking for a closer view with more sharp detail. This was the best of that kind of image, but it was in black and white. It's a warm liver color. But if you ended up writing about it on the exam, because the slide doesn't show that and saying it looks cool, you'd get credit. But it's a liver color, which is warm brown, right? Kind of medium brown. There's simulated texture here. It's quite well done. Look at this. The eyes, there's some personality here. The lips and the mouth, the ears, and even the way it's standing, the stag, showing off how powerful it is. So there is simulated texture. I know on the antlers too. The body, not so much. The body is just the real smooth texture of the stone. Of course, it's been damaged. That isn't what it would have looked like. Obviously, it somehow got broken off. Someone probably stole this piece after the king died, or maybe it's hard to say. Anyway, it was found in the ground this way. So it would have been smooth, real texture of stone on the bottom part, but from about the neck up, it's simulated texture, and that's done with, of course, carved lines. It is completely stable up until you get to the antlers. The antlers obviously are dynamic, but everything, it's a right angle, the neck and the body and the legs are all straight. And so that is a mostly stable body with dynamic antlers on the top part. And it's balanced, completely symmetrical. If you were to, actually have seen this it's in the same exhibit room as the purse cover. It would be, totally symmetrical. If it's not obvious, the top part of this section of the antlers has been broken off. They would have been up right at the same height. So it's balanced left to right and top to bottom. I would say it's a single mass, and it's 4 inches tall. So the only technique for space really here is the real space of this piece of bone that's 5 inches tall. The rhythm is obvious. The antlers, the ears, the legs actually almost look like a single mass, but you can sort of tell that there's bunched together legs. So there's plenty of rhythm, and it, let's see, doesn't have any modeling because it's just the lighting from the museum. Okay, I think we've covered everything. Yeah, okay. We'll move on now to the next must know is cross page from Lindisfarne Gospel. Cross, 2 words, page from Lindisfarne. That's Lindesfarne. It's a town in England. Gospel means Bible. Gospel, Gospel. Cross page from Lindisfarne Gospel. Of course, the location again is England, and the date is 700. Okay, so this again is from you could just say early Middle Ages. That's the title of this topic of this lecture, right? Is early medieval art. But another way to say it is perfectly accurate is the Dark Ages. The only group or class, I should say, only class of people, or you can say type of people that were almost always literate, educated, meaning could read and write. Other than the higher nobility, the king, maybe the queen, quite often the queen, the top members of nobility, not even all nobles could read and write, but the upper level of nobility could. The only other group were priests, and that's what this is. It's an example of a page in a Bible hand painted by priests. So here's the next definition. Okay, illuminated manuscript, 2 words. And again, these words are right in front of you if you should be having, of course, when you write your definitions, this list of terms to know in front of you. Illuminated manuscript. So that definition isn't too long. It's a richly illustrated, oh no, sorry, it's a manuscript. I started with that in the middle. I'll start over. I apologize. It's a manuscript created by monks in a monastery, comma, a manuscript created by monks in a monastery, comma, with richly illustrated texts made by hand, with richly illustrated texts made by hand. And those illustrations are what we're looking, one of those illustrations. So there's the text and then there's the illustration. So every 20 pages or so, if it was a Bible, every section, I guess new section of the Bible, you'd see a whole page, a full page illustration. So I'll say it again. It's a manuscript created by monks in a monastery with richly illustrated text created by hand. The monks definitely didn't have any other way of writing things or of drawing and illustrating things. In fact, even China, where they were starting to make copies of things, it was still all hand done. The first printing press wasn't until very late in the Middle Ages, which of course we're not going to cover that, but it was in the 1400s in Germany, the first printing press. So this is so long before that everything was hand drawn and handwritten. Okay, so it has a cross. It should be obvious, a Christian cross. A cross, what is it? The page, it's called the cross page because of that, of the first actually illustration. So that's part of the meaning here. This is the frontispiece. There's no other way to say it. Frontis with an S-I-S. 2 words, frontispiece. It's the first illustration. In any book is a frontispiece. Books, any illustrated books today, they all have a frontispiece. Whatever the author or the publisher thinks is the best image for the first thing in the book. So this would be the first page with an illustration at the front of the book. But there's a little more to it. It's also got a hint of the animal style. These are snakes intertwining with each other. And they are symbolic of evil, right? Supposedly snakes in the Bible especially are always symbolic of evil, temptation, what have you. Deadly sin, how are you going to say evil? And so the evil symbols of the snakes, writhing around each other is superimposed with or over those evil images is the Bible. Sorry, I meant the Bible. The cross on top of the snakes. So can anybody guess what that's supposed to symbolize? The cross is superimposed and it symbolizes the church, which is supposed to be obviously a symbol of good, or at least that's the theory behind it, the teaching that they were doing in church, right? And in the Bible is superimposed over snakes, symbolic of evil. So can anybody guess what? There's a political or religious and political statement that they're trying to make with this.
Supposed to mean like protecting from the sins.
Pretty much, yeah. That's one way to. It's a different way to put it, but than I have. But so there's you could say it this way. It symbolizes the fact that Christianity, which means supposedly the good beliefs in Christian, religion. Christianity, just a short way to say it. Christianity is now dominant over the old pagan beliefs. The pagan beliefs were supposedly evil. The ones pre-Christian, before the dominance of the Christian church, people believed in all kinds of different gods, and even some of them were evil. You don't have to have seen Marvel Universe movies to know, and that's not just the Norse gods, but the ones in all of Europe or everywhere in the world. Really, there's gods that represent evil and good in every religious, system or belief. So I'll say it again. The cross symbolizes the dominance of Christianity, which is supposed to be a force for good, over evil, which would be symbolizing, or the symbol, of the pagan. Pagan is a word that probably will find useful on the final. Pagan, I think I've used it before. Yeah, I did, I know, but I'll say it again. Pagan is any non-Christian religion, according to, not today, most people wouldn't use that word, but back in the Middle Ages, that would be a word that is a criticism of, right, or a way of describing the non-Christian believers. In other words, Muslims, Jews, atheists, Shinto, Buddhists, whatever. If they weren't Christian, they somehow were pagan, and meaning they were not good, and therefore the Christian religion was the symbol for good, which is what the cross is supposed to indicate, is now dominant over the old or pagan religions, which again is supposed to represent evil. Obviously a very one-sided view of things, but that's how the church would have at that time done. Almost every Bible had a cross page in it, by the way. This is not just this one version. It's in a museum somewhere in England. All right, let's do a formal analysis. It's completely balanced left to right, but it should be obvious that the arms of the cross are above the midpoint. So it's, I would say, unbalanced toward the top. The rhythm is powerful here with the arms of the cross in all four directions. The borders, right? And these geometric patterns repeat. You notice that on the edges here. And then the snakes, that's powerful. Example, of course, of rhythms. And then we have similar texture. Well, that's a matter of opinion. Maybe on the snakes, but I don't really see it here. I used to say there must be some, because snakes have to, their bodies aren't entirely just snake skin, right? They have heads and tails, but you can't see them. So I would say there really isn't any similar texture here. I don't see. And there's no modeling, absolutely no modeling. It is almost entirely, or just say mostly, dynamic, because the snakes obviously are dynamic. And the curved lines around the cross, but the cross itself is stable, right? It's upright. It's right angle arms of the cross, and the outer border is stable, but it's more dynamic than stable. The largest mass, that's easy, the cross. And then I would say it's the geometric patterns or border decorations along the border, I should say. And then it would be the snakes. For space, we just have one technique. It's probably obvious, is overlapping. The snakes overlap each other. The cross overlaps the snakes. And let's see, of course, there's the rhythm of the snakes and the arms of the cross. I think I've said rhythm before. Let's see. Oh, colors. We got cool on the blue snakes, right? Or bluish green. They vary slightly, either inside of or under or below the cross, but both blue, green, and blue are obviously cool colors. The cross itself is warm, and the pink snakes, I don't know if there are any, by the way, they're obviously in this illustration, they're warm. And then we have the colors of mixed of warm and cool colors along the borders. And then finally, we have the lines are just almost all, well, actually, they're both, sorry, the cross, obviously, and the borders are all bold lines. And all the snakes, below that are thin lines. Okay, we're doing pretty well on time. So I think what we'll do is I'm going to do this because we have more slides after the break, and the way it's going, I'm going to cut one of the, not this one. This slide isn't going to get cut from the study list. I'll tell you why in a minute. But before we get to the next must know, it's the fourth one down on the list tonight. I think what I'll do is cut the last one for the first half. So why don't we do that now? If you just take your pen out, pens, and cross off the last one under, for week 13, under, well, it says first half. West work of San Pantaleon. the patron saint of pants. Yeah, that's one of my students. And nothing to do with the Spanish bill or that means pants. It's just it's not that. I mean, it's an interesting site, but I want to, not have everyone get too worn out before the end. Of my voice sometimes starts to give out by 9:15. So hopefully we can end by that time. We might. Anyway, everybody got that fifth slide down on tonight's list, right? Just above the second half list. Cross it off. Westwork of St. Pantaleon, Germany. It's not going to be on the test. Let me see if I even still have that slide here. No, that's not it. Okay, but what we're going to do is do two more before the break, because then the second half won't be as long. And I think we, always prefer, at least I do, a break roughly halfway through the evening. Okay, so here's our next must know. This one is ship's apostrophe s ship's head figure from Oseberg. Oseberg. It's a city in Norway, the country of Norway. So again, Oseberg. Ship's head figure from Oseberg, Norway, 820. And I guess I need to stand slightly corrected because I have to admit I had noticed the last time I gave this lecture this very semester, a couple of weeks ago, to the other class that covers overlaps with the same material. So I showed this slide 2 weeks ago to that class. And I was saying Stockstead got it wrong in the title because for years, you don't have to write this. Her title for this was Ship's Head from Oseberg. It is not a ship's head. The Vikings didn't use miniature carvings for their longboats. So let's now start the meaning with correct now. So in other words, somehow, somewhere along the line, someone pointed out to her that it's not an actual head for the prow of a ship. It's too small. It's only 5 inches long. That would be laughable if you saw one of those things with, at the end of a boat coming at you. You wouldn't be scared at all, right? So what is this? Here we go. This is the model for a full-size ship's head ornament for a Viking longboat. I'll say it again. This is the model made to create the full-size ship's head ornament, which would have been maybe 5 feet long, for a Viking, with a capital V. I know you all know those words. There's so many TV shows about Vikings now. For a Viking longboat, one word. If longboat doesn't mean much to you, you're going to see an illustration one on the very next slide. Those were the style of ships the Vikings used to travel all over the world. So we'll say who the Vikings were and why they're such an important part of the meaning of this in a minute. But what we're looking at is a piece of bone. It's the next fact about the meaning. It's a carved piece of bone about 5 inches long. In fact, I think it's more like 4.5. So say nearly or about 5 inches long. And it would have been the model used to create a full-size version, of course, in wood. Remember the Celts, the Vikings, should be obvious they were Celts, right? They are very much of the Celtic culture. I already said, but if you didn't write it before, this meaning of this slide, you should. The Celts were master workers, carvers in both metal or metal workers and wood carvers, both. Well, the actual piece for the boat would have been wood. This is carved bone, okay, because it's the material that was, I guess, easy to carve so that someone could then look at it, obviously, as a model for their full-size ship head. Okay, but that doesn't tell us what it is. Nobody knows what it is. I've never seen a consistent, I've seen books on this and, not just this, but, this kind of we don't know. All we know is the Vikings used various kinds of mythical creatures, right? For fierce-looking mythical creatures for the decorations on their longboats. In other words, to try and strike fear in their enemies. Because when these boats approached the coast, of course, they came from the sea, anywhere that the Vikings invaded, and they invaded, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4 continents. That's pretty impressive. I'll explain in a minute. The other part of the meeting is who were the Vikings. But to finish up on what this piece is, it was meant to strike fear, the actual final version of the full-size, wood carving, to strike fear in the hearts of their enemies when they attacked. because it'd be the first thing you'd see coming out of the fog or the mist or whatever coming towards you, and you'd know you were about to be attacked by Vikings. So who were the Vikings? This is the really important part of the meaning of this. If it's on the essay part of the final, which I would say it has about a 50-50 chance, because it's a pretty important topic. The Vikings were the fiercest warriors, the greatest, I already said, the greatest metal and woodworkers, and the greatest navigators. That's the most important part. In the I can't speak. In the Middle Ages, I'll say it again. They were the fiercest warriors, the greatest wood and metal workers, and the fiercest warriors in the Middle Ages. No, nobody could compare to them unless you go maybe as far as fierceness of warriors go. The Mongolians, okay, Genghis Khan, okay, yes, but he was all the way across the opposite end, right, of Asia. So not just in Europe, they were the greatest navigators on Earth, and the proof of that is part of the meaning of this. So what would they do with their longboat besides attack people? And why would they attack? You can guess. Not just to take over a castle or a monastery or a town or city or even a whole kingdom. They conquered several kingdoms. It would be to get the wealth, of course, steal, you could say, or capture the wealth, and also to get slaves, because they would sell the women and children. They'd usually kill the male inhabitants, not always, but use or make them into slaves, and then they would sell, often, not always, but often sell the women and children, below, the male children below fighting age, and all the girls and women, to slave markets in other parts of the world. That was one of the main sources of their wealth. But when it comes to voyages and their being the greatest navigators, this is the part that I think should be what is the most impressive fact about the Vikings. They had these wooden boats that weren't even close to 100 feet long. They were like 60 or 70 feet long. They were open boats. They crossed not only the North Sea, where they're from. I think everybody knows, but if you don't, then you should write this. They're from, well, I just said Norway, but Scandinavia, what today we call Scandinavia, Denmark, Norway, and Sweden, not Finland. My first girlfriend in high school was a Finnish exchange student. She used to get upset when people called us Scandinavian. We're not Scandinavian. We were part of that Viking culture. We're Slavic. We're Eastern Europeans. So not Finland, but what are now the countries of Denmark, Norway, and Sweden, or the heart of Scandinavia, and Iceland also, where the singer Bjork is from. Some those are the cultures where the Vikings originated. So they took their longboats around the North Sea, right? That's the whole northern area of seas north of France, then down through the coasts of France and Spain into the Mediterranean, all the way into the Black Sea, where all the fighting and the horrible massacres are occurring, in the Black Sea, in the war now in Ukraine. And then they took them across the Atlantic and started colonies in what's now Canada and New England. 1,000 years ago, they discovered, quote unquote, as far as Europeans go, right? They for themselves found or discovered. They were the first ones to cross the Atlantic, not Columbus. 500 years before Columbus, they were crossing the Atlantic. And they had colonies that lasted 100 years on the coast. We have evidence of them. They are ruined houses and foundations of forts and things. I don't think that's in many history books even now, but it should be. It's not guesswork. It's not some historian's theory. It's well proven. They actually founded several colonies, mostly in what's now Newfoundland, or just say the coast of Canada, and as far south as Massachusetts, which of course is in the US. New England, and then they abandoned them after about 100 years because they couldn't keep them economically. They were losing money, and the population was starving. They weren't good farmers, so they had to depend on hunting and fishing, and they finally just said, okay, well, we'll abandon them. But this was a 500 years, 1000 AD, when they first landed in the east coast of Canada and New England. So that's what we mean when we say the greatest navigators.
I'm sorry, I have a question.
Please go ahead. Yes.
Do you know if they made it to Africa?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah. That's what I meant to say. Thank you for bringing that up. They invaded the various Muslim, not all of them, but several of the Muslim kingdoms in North Africa, that were part of the Muslim world. And they invaded Turkey, right, which was definitely Muslim by that time. Yeah. And they usually almost never lost a battle. I mean, once in a while they would, but in other words, they were not only the fiercest warriors, but they were very clever strategically. They might only have 1,000 warrior, well, usually more than that. If they had 30 ships with 100 men on each ship, okay, what's that, 3,000, a few thousand warriors to conquer an entire kingdom, but they almost always won their battles. This is something you don't have to write. Yes, they did invade North Africa and what we now call the Middle East, including Turkey, all of the coastline of Europe. And yes, they founded, okay, I might as well bring this as the last fact because it's so relevant to what we see, the tragedy happening in Ukraine. They founded the first civilized urban culture in what's now Ukraine, i.e., almost 1,000. Okay, let's say 500 years at least before Russia existed. I think some of you know this. I mean, it's obscene that the Russians are claiming that the Ukrainians had never had their own country. It's the other way around. They were an offshoot of Vikings. Vikings, wait a minute, how did they get all the way into the interior of Ukraine? They picked up their boats on their shoulders and carried them for hundreds of miles from one river or lake to another. And then they take the boat that as far as it could go on water and then pick it up again. So they founded what's now Kiev in 800 AD. There was no Moscow. Moscow didn't exist until the 1400s, or I think the 1300s. So several hundred years before there was a Russia or Moscow, there was Kievian Rus, it was called, which is the basis for Ukraine. And it was a former, or a conquest, you could say, or a former colony of the Vikings. So the Vikings got all, yes, they got around. If you look at the map and see how many places in both hemispheres that they actually, the only parts of the world they didn't get to were East Asia. They didn't get that far, but they even traded with the Persians, both slaves and gold and things and woodworking. And they had, respect. Wherever they went, they were feared. In other words, if the Viking, don't write this, but there was an old saying, if you see a Viking longboat approaching, you have two choices, run or die. Because they almost never lost a battle. So all those TV shows, they may exaggerate a little. I think there's a new one with Stellan Skarsgård, isn't there? I've read good reviews of it. Yeah, that, you know what, if you wanted to watch one of those episodes and write 2 pages about what you learned, because we're covering this, I would give you 10 points extra credit if you choose to do that before the end of final exams. I mean, before the end of May, because final exams end before Memorial Day, but I give you guys an extension until May 30th to turn in extra credit, any extra credit. All right, let's do a formal analysis and then we'll do one more slide and take a break. All right, this is balanced. I mean, if you draw a line down the middle, the mass is about equal on either side. And of course, top to bottom with the mouth open like that, the two, parts of the jaw, it's roughly balanced. If you looked at it head on, directly, straight on, it would also be balanced. It's full of the rhythm. These are snakes again. You see those symbols, snakes, they're, symbolic in this case of the fierceness and power. You could say the evil, but they didn't think of themselves as evil. So their fierceness and power, fearsomeness, if you want to say, of their own warriors. So this is an example of the animal style. They were the dominant culture in any place where they invaded, they became the rulers, right? So you could say it's another example of the animal style, but we don't know what kind of animal this is. I've had people write papers on this and say, it looks like a dog. It looks like a sea serpent. It looks like a dragon. We don't know. It's some kind of mythical creature that's not a normal everyday, animal that you'd see, in real life. But it's meant to look fierce, of course. And then we have the rhythm. Well, I already mentioned the snakes and the patterns, decorative patterns. I mean, that's just purely imaginary, of course, on the grid pattern on the snout and around the eyes. And then there is the lips and the teeth, although missing some of them. And that is the only place where I see realistic simulated texture is the mouth, the whole mouth area. That looks realistic. And I guess the very tip of the nose. But the eyes, even that's not realistic. And the rest of the head, that's all just the texture of the bone itself, which is of course carved bone, not wood. Remember, carved bone. So the lines are all carved. And then we have the modeling. This from the museum, but it was carved this way so that the shadows, if it was a big piece of wood, it would have deep shadows from the sunlight. And then let's see, do we have line as bold outline? I don't really see that here. I'd say there's a little bit of thin outline, I guess, around the mouth. The largest mass, it's a single mass. And for space, the snakes overlap each other. There is that one technique, but otherwise it's just a real space of about a 4.5 inch long. Actually, it's 5 inches by 4.5 tall. So just, you can say about 5 That's close enough. Inches is the real space. It's in real space, a three-dimensional object, of course. And the color is the warm color of the bone, the yellow kind of warm color. And I think I've said it's entirely dynamic. I don't know. I didn't, did I? Yeah, there's nothing stable. I don't see anything stable here. Okay, let's go to our next must know. I'm going to skip this, even though it's an important slide, but we're running short of time. In my other class where we had an extra week and a half, because it's St. Basil's in Moscow. Quick aside for those who might care, if you want to, for extra credit or just for your own interest, about Ivan the Terrible, the incident where he kills his own son over his son not letting him sleep with his wife. This church was built to atone for that, the guilt that Ivan the Terrible, the Tsar, felt over killing his own son. It's in Red Square, right in front of, I've been there several times, right in front of the Kremlin, where that incident occurred. And that isn't a myth. There's myths about it, but the one that isn't a myth is the story of why was it commissioned by the Tsar, Ivan the Terrible, by the two best architects in Russia. And they did create a beautiful building, I think the World Heritage site, right? Because he felt guilt over killing his own son. But you don't have to know that, because that cut that off the list. Okay, this one, very high possibility. I'd say at least 50-50, and definitely not going to be cut from the study list. So it's the first one for the second half, and I want to take a break. Bayeux, Bayeux. It's a city in France. Tapestry, Bayeux, Tapestry, France, 1082. Okay, so a tapestry, well, that tells us a little bit about what it is. So here's the first fact. It is a section of a 220-foot long tapestry. One section of a 220-foot long tapestry created by nuns to commemorate, right after the fact, right, to commemorate, not celebrate. Celebrate is something that happens right after a victory or battle. So this is years later. So I'll say it again, created by nuns to commemorate the victory of Norman the Conqueror. Norman, right, there he is, Norman the Conqueror, the king of Normandy. We'll say what Normandy was in a minute, over the Saxon king of England. That's him. So what we have is William the Conqueror, who was Norman. I said Norman, I apologize. I meant William was his first name. He was from Normandy. He was a king of Normandy. And that's him on the green, unusual color, right? The green horse, directing his soldiers. And there's a Viking longboat. So that should tell you something, but it's just obvious, of course, unless you've already studied this piece. So what is it? This depicting? It depicts the invasion of England by the king of Normandy named William the Conqueror, in which he defeated the Saxon, and that's S with a capital S, of course, Saxon, Saxon king of England named Harold. That's him. And his nickname in history, William's nickname is William the Conqueror. This guy's nickname, Harold the Unready. That tells you everything. He didn't believe that the Normans would invade, but he should have known, because guess what? They were descended from Vikings. That's what Normandy was. It was a later version of a Viking kingdom. The Vikings invaded northern France. I think everybody knows Normandy's in northern France, right? It's on the coast of northern France. So there was no France that far back. So this was a kingdom that had been founded by Vikings who had invaded like a couple hundred years earlier. And by this time, of course, they intermarried with the French population, what was the roots of what would become France. They had intermarried and they spoke French. They had become Francophiled, right? However you want to say Frenchified, but that sounds like food. Right? They had become very French culturally. They spoke French. and they had French manners and customs. That's not a minor point. That's one of the most important facts about this slide. And it's this slide, I should say, or this work of art, this scene depicts an event without which we couldn't speak to each other the way we are now. We could not communicate with each other in the English language. This event started the whole modern English language. Now that should surprise a few of you, or at least get your interest, because that's the main fact about this you should remember if it's on the essay part of the final. This invasion, in which the Norman king, the kingdom of Normandy, invades and conquers the Saxon kingdom, defeating and actually killed, beheaded the king, the Saxon king he had defeated. It only took him one battle. After that invasion, he instituted French law, French language, and French customs. And so today, the English language, this is the main point here, has more French words, strictly French words, as well as some blended French and English words than any other language. In other words, English is a blend of French and Saxon or Celtic. What was there before was, you wouldn't recognize the language spoken by the early medieval kings of England. The Saxons, we wouldn't recognize it. Most people would, unless you studied it. It's such an early version. It is a form of English, but it's very, very different. So the modern English language has its roots in this event, which was in you have to know the year, but it was 1066. And it took only one battle. Again, you don't have to know the name for those who might be curious. It was called the Battle of Hastings. It is an important event in the history of Great Britain, as 1776, and of course the Declaration of Independence is in our history. In other words, if you don't know this, take a look sometime, if you have a moment of, curiosity, for those who, interested in, language and linguistics. And just look through, I assume it'll all be online these days, but a real dictionary, to me, that means printed, any form of dictionary of the English language. And you look at the roots of those words, and over 20%, so it's the last fact you could write about this, that over 20% of all the words in modern English have French origin. That's the highest percentage, because there's a few German and some Italian, some Spanish words, of course. But the largest proportion of foreign influences in the English language comes from this invasion. Well, I guess you could add one more fact. I don't think it's really a minor. This is the last successful invasion of the British Isles. The last time the British Isles were conquered by an invading army. That's not over 900 years ago. In case you don't already know this, well, we had, let's see, the Spanish Armada didn't happen. The ships never even landed. They were all set afire, right, in the English Channel under Queen Elizabeth I, some of you know, in the 1500s. And then Napoleon tried to invade England and turned around. He didn't even cross the channel when he had his boats and his soldiers ready to attack, and then they got scared. And then we know Hitler threatened to invade England during World War II and never actually did. So it's a last successful invasion or conquest by an invader of the British Isles. And that's pretty strong, statement to make. The British Isles have remained free of invasions for over 900 years. Okay, so let's do the form analysis and then we'll take a break here. You've got the colors here are cool on the green on some of the clothing and definitely on William the Conqueror's horse. And of course, if you don't know the original 1939 color film of The Wizard of Oz, there's a green horse in that. That's the only other place I've seen green is a color for a horse, but that's cool. Color-wise. And then the warm is the dominant colors because you have these, kind of browns and tans and even kind of rust color. So most of the colors are warm. There is similar texture here. It's pretty well done on the sail of the Viking longboat. On the wooden siege tower, that's what this is. They're building a siege. They didn't need it because they won an open battle or a battle in open fields called Hastings. They didn't even have to attack London, in other words, so they never needed it, but they built them in case any of these wooden towers. So that's somewhat similar texture there. This is definitely similar texture on the stone lookout tower where these two guys just came down to tell their king, you look out, they're coming, and he didn't believe them. And then I'd say on the tent, that simulated texture too, right? On the roof of the tent. Okay, and then we have the rhythm, of course, of all the soldiers, and the horses, the arms, hands, and legs, right? And even the two towers have some vaguely similar overall shapes. And then there's only one technique for space that should be obvious, and that's the overlapping of the clothing and the weapons over the soldiers. And then William, that's his top general. So William and his main general overlapping the horses, of course. And I guess you could say there's overlapping, yeah, here of the sail of the longboat over the soldiers and over the king, Saxon king's head over the tent. What's the largest mass? I think it's equal between the tent and the boat, the longboat. And then it's a close call. If this is one mass, these horses overlap. If you count them as, I'd call that the second largest mass. If you don't, then you just can decide. I mean, is this tower wider? Yes, but it just is tall, right? Or not quite. I mean, as tall as this one. So maybe it's the wider of the two towers, the siege tower, and then each of the two horses, you could say. Or actually, King Harold, he's bigger than any other figure, so you could say he's the second largest. Yeah, the tent and the boat though are almost equal, so they're the two largest masses, and then King Harold, and then you can decide for that. No, I don't see any modeling here. There's no modeling. The lines, a mixture of thin and bold. Thin on the horses, and the faces of the soldiers, bold on the longboat and the towers, and the King's Harold's tent. So it's a mixture of bold and warm, bold and thin lines. It's stable mostly on the human figures sitting or standing upright, the two towers, the siege tower and the lookout tower. And of course, the poles on the tent, but the roof of the tent, the sail and the prow of the longboat are dynamic. It's more stable than dynamic, but it has some elements of both. Okay, and is it balanced? Oh yeah, I'd say so. These two figures are in the middle, the two towers flanking them, and then this longboat, as I said, is about the same size as the tent. So left to right, it's definitely roughly balanced. And then you could say also from top to bottom, depending on where you draw the line. Okay, I think we covered texture. Yeah, I covered that already, I think. All right, so why don't we go ahead and take our break? If people want to make it a 15-minute break, then we would start at, let's see, 8:06. We'll end a little earlier if we do it that way. Is that okay with everybody? Anybody have an objection if we say, let's make it, yeah.
Okay.
15 minutes would, you see it's 7:51, so that would be 8:06. We'll get to the first slide, and then we certainly maybe a good 15 minutes early, but we do have some important slides to cover. At least one of the cathedrals after the break will appear on the final. So here we go. I'm going to stop share. You guys take 15 minutes. See you then. Okay, let me hit record here. Whoops, that was the wrong thing. Weird. One icon doesn't jive with the other. That's the top and the bottom. At least not on my screen. Okay, I think it's recording now. It should be. Yes, it is. Okay, good. All right, so we're going to start the second half with one of my hand-printed diagrams. I want to say chart. That sounds like it's more complex than it is. And this is something that you want to study for the final, because the true false section where definitions and terms will appear as they did on the midterm on the final will almost certainly ask you a question about the three main features of Romanesque churches. So I'll hold this up just like this so it's as clear as I can make it for you to take time to take note of it, or even a screenshot, but of course it'll be in the video recorded posted, I meant, on YouTube, hopefully by 8 p.m. on Friday. So there's three main features. We're going to see them as we go through this next few slides that mark the style Romanesque church architecture. The first is concentric rounded arches. There's really not much else to say about that, except that's, you could describe it as an arch within an arch or a double arch, but a double arch implies two arches side by side. That's not the right phrase. So the only correct way to describe the style of Romanesque church archways is concentric rounded arches. The second feature is pretty also self-explanatory. And again, these are unique. These features didn't exist on ancient buildings, Roman or early medieval buildings. Short, stubby columns. That may sound odd, but that is the right phrase to use, because you'll see why I say it that way. I don't think that's in any textbook, but that is a way to recognize the style of columns on a Romanesque church. And then the third feature, of course, you can't see, obviously, until it isn't obvious, I'm sorry, unless you go inside, and we will do that with our slides of at least one interior of a Romanesque church. The ceilings have Romanesque groined vaulting, and all three features that I just showed you will be apparent by the end of this lecture. I think we'll still be able to end at least several minutes early. We'll see where we're at by around 9:15, and I may just cut one of the remaining 5 slides. But right now we are on Toulouse. The first must know now. Let's get that slide up to the screen. There it goes. Hopefully, whoops. Oh yeah, I know. We just got to do it this way. Hopefully it'll show, because sometimes it stops showing when we do the break, because it hasn't been, it's been too long. So let's just double check here. This is the next must know. Can everybody see this?
Yes.
Yeah, thank you very
Yes.
much. Thanks, that's helpful. All right. So what do we, whoops, it likes doing that, even though I didn't hit the forward bar. Likes to jump around. Okay, so here we go. Again, the first must know slide for this half. I won't cut this slide from the study list. Toulouse Cathedral. 2 words. Toulouse is a town in southern France. Toulouse, Cathedral. Toulouse Cathedral, France. 1080 or 1080. Okay, so that's 1080, not AD, as in common era. These dates I've said before the break are all common era, so you don't need to even worry about the letters before and after common era. Okay, so it's a Romanesque style cathedral. Already, I think, no, I hadn't. That's right. We got a bunch of new definitions, and then at least one of these will appear, maybe 2 of them. They're not long ones, or not super long, so that's the saving grace here. Cathedral is at the bottom of this page we've been on. You see the list of 3 main features of Romanesque churches. I just showed you the drawing. So a cathedral is the most important and largest Christian church in a given city, the most important and usually largest Christian church in a given city, comma, over which a bishop presides, period. That's, you have to, all that together, taken together, is what constitutes a cathedral. And it used to be there was only Catholics that had cathedrals, right? But that's before there was all these new branches of Christianity, and you don't have to know the details. But obviously now there's Protestants and there's, Mormons who are, Christian but not Catholic. So that's why I say it that way. I'll repeat that definition. The cathedral is the most important and usually largest Christian church in a given city, in any city where they are located, comma, over which a bishop presides. Okay, so a bishop would be the highest ranking person in the Catholic Church, and but there are bishops that are Catholic, of course. There's several Protestant denominations have bishops, so you can't just say Catholic. So a bishop is a Christian official, church official, high-ranking church official who would preside over a city or even a region, a large urban area, if you want to write it that way, such as Toulouse. Toulouse is a pretty big city in southern France. So the bishop of the Toulouse region would have been the bishop of this cathedral. Also, he was the architect. That's an important detail, that in the Middle Ages, most cathedrals were designed by their own bishops. There were no full-time professional architects. Some people like Michelangelo later, hundreds of years later, trained themselves to be architects and practice that as a, professional pursuit, but they weren't licensed and credentials. That's a much more recent concept. So once again, the bishops were the architects of these churches, of these cathedrals. They designed them. And if it's a Romanesque style cathedral, let's take a closer look. It will have the three features I mentioned. You can only see two of them on the outside because the ceiling, of course, isn't visible to you look inside. So here are your concentric rounded arches. You see them between the trees here, right? And they are on the apse. Remember what apses are? We covered that, right? After the midterm. The semicircular projecting sections on the outer walls. Well, they help support that massive tower. So the Romanesque concentric rounded arches, that's what Romanesque means, right? That's redundant to say Romanesque concentric rounded arches. Romanesque arches are concentric and rounded. They go all the way up the tower. Now here they're pointed back, just I guess the bishop playing around a little bit, decided to do a little variety there. But the other part of what you can see on a Romanesque style cathedral from the outside, that is not a detail, right? A stylistic detail, but a practical fact is this. This is the other really important fact about Romanesque style architecture. Why was this style created? And why was it so popular? It was used all over Europe. Because Romanesque style architecture was capable of supporting much taller towers than any previous style. I'll say that again. The Romanesque style for church architecture was capable of supporting much taller towers than any style before. Because these rounded arches, these concentric, rounded arches, and the short stubby columns, we haven't looked closely, that's relatively wide. I mean, we're talking about in comparison, of course, relative to Greek and Roman temples with 60-foot tall columns that were tall and relatively narrow. The ones on the tower, the same thing. They're wider in proportion and shorter both than any earlier style of columns from Greek or Roman temples. So the short stubby columns are found all the way from, on the apses, on the outer wall, up to the top level of the tower. If you put those together with that third feature you'll see in the next slide, which is the ceiling with the Romanesque groin vaulting, that style of support combined on the ceiling with the exterior supports of these relatively thick or stubby columns and the concentric arches, you have a very strong system of design or architecture. It's a very strong support system, is a way to say it. It can support towers of up to 300 feet, and this tower is close to that. It's something like around 280 feet. Well, I do the dimensions and all of the elements of composition when we get to the formal analysis. But for now, let's sort of just take a segue, and you'll have to write now about these next few slides. If it's on the exam, that's the view you'll have. So you can see the whole basic exterior set of features in this one view. But if you were to get up closer to it, and I found some of these slides online, you know what? I don't see them. Why aren't they here? I guess yep, for whatever reason. Oh, I know what it is. I know. Sorry, I got to go back. Yeah, I put them in before this. Sorry, you got to go all the way back. Yeah, this is no way to this really go faster. There we go. This is the same church. That slide isn't adequate, even though it's the only one that shows the entire building with the nave, which we're going to define what a nave is in just a minute. It's one of the new terms for tonight from the list of terms. But there's your nearly 300-foot tall tower. You can imagine how heavy that is, how massive. And it's supported by, of course, the walls, but also by these rounded, concentric rounded arches and these short, stubby columns. And in this view, you might see, I think, much more clearly, well, you definitely can, those Romanesque, right, or concentric rounded arches. They're just stronger. They're much more stable. They support more weight. And then the walls of the churches also tended to be thicker. And then you have these short, stubby columns. There they are, right there on all the apses. And here's, I think, I have at least 2 or 3 other views, which you don't have to remember, but just for your own interest or information. Here again, you see the concentric rounded arches on the apses all the way up, both sets of apses, right? The upper and lower ones, and the short stubby columns, mostly on the upper level of apse and on the tower. And then if you walked around it, you'd see it from a distance here with this massive tower. And here's the detail that's even better for the short stubby columns. You see the reason the right way to describe them. And then there's your consistently, right, concentric rounded arches, Romanesque arches everywhere. All the arches are on the part. And then this is just a view at night, kind of a nice shot, and a winter view. So let's now go all the way back to where we were at, because we have several slides after this one. Of course, whoops, we went too far. Let's do one more thing about the meaning, which is that these towers kept getting taller and taller when a bishop would design a cathedral, and then a neighboring bishop, right, in the neighboring city nearby, so I don't mean literally right next door, but, you know, adjacent, right, a city in a different province with a bishop, would build a new cathedral in this style. So in other words, whenever Romanesque cathedrals were designed and then built by different bishops, they would the towers would get taller. Usually the later, in other words, that a Romanesque church or cathedral, especially I should say cathedral, was built, the taller the tower. So can anybody guess what? There were 2, I'll give you a clue, 2 reasons why these towers were so tall and why they always had, you know, this kind of rivalry going.
To show the power.
Yeah, exactly. You said it perfectly. Yes, to show the power of that bishop, because the taller the tower, the greater the power. I know I just came up with that one. It sounds like a line from the 60s radical. The taller the tower, the greater the power. You don't have to write that, but here's another phrase I've been using for decades, which is not in any textbook. There was a kind of personal ego involved in the symbolism of the taller the tower, the greater the power. You can write it that way. And there's another way to say that. Some of you heard of Freud, the famous psychologist. They came up with a theory about men comparing their, you know what, their private parts. If you don't know that phrase, I'm not going to say it. I don't want to get fired online here anyway. It's called blank envy, a word that begins with P. Okay, so these bishops, you can write this or not, had what I call a case of tower envy. They wanted each one to show, my tower is bigger than your tower. I mean, I'm not exaggerating. That sounds like a corny way to phrase it, but it is true. There was a conscious effort to outdo each of their predecessors by building a bigger, taller tower. So yeah, that was perfectly stated when you said it's all about the power. But there is another reason why these towers, these tall towers were being built. That doesn't have to do with ego and the power of an individual, a bishop. And that's a religious symbolism. I guess some of you already have thought of it. especially when you look at the top, with the pointed spire, right? What other symbol could that symbolize? That the purpose of the church itself, not the bishop. Supposed to symbolize anybody? I'm sure somebody has an idea. Well, it's a church. What do you do in a church, or supposed to do anyway?
To pray.
Pray to God. Right?
Oh yeah, like pointing on.
Yeah, it's pointing towards God or heaven. You can say it either way. It's supposed to symbolize the desire of or goal, you could say rather, the goal of the worshipers to, think of God or pray to God, and eventually, if possible, to go to heaven. So the tower, you could say in short, single sentences, these tall towers were symbolic of, the quest or the desire, right, to get closer to God and closer to heaven, which is what you're supposed to be, doing when you pray, right? Okay, so they have both a religious and a personal or political symbolic meaning. So that's the last part of the meaning notes. Balance, well, left to right, definitely symmetrical. Almost all these medieval churches were, whatever style they were in. You'll see that with Gothic cathedrals. There are exceptions, but in general, they were symmetrical. But obviously, it's unbalanced toward the bottom. For space, well, we have a tower that's nearly 300 feet. It's not quite, so you could say just under, about 280 feet if you round it off. And then the interior, the ceiling inside, the right word for that is nave, but we haven't defined that yet, so you don't have to write that word yet for the notes on this slide. The ceiling inside the building is about 100 feet tall. Pretty tall ceilings, sometimes less, sometimes 80, but they were always between 80 and these old Romanesque churches, and 100, maybe 120 feet. So say about or nearly, I think it's just slightly less than, so nearly 100 feet, the ceiling. That's all you have to write for space. Obviously, it's real. Remember, with buildings, there are no techniques for space. It's all about the real space, the dimensions. Okay, colors, well, it's a mixture of cool and warm. It's warm on the red brick, and that is red brick and red clay tile. Red brick on the walls, red clay tile on the roofs. Cool on the stone for the columns and the arches, and the slate. That's slate, right? That's kind of very heavy tile, right? And it's still used in some churches. So you could even say the cool gray color of the tiles on part of the roof is also is part of the cool colors, as well as the stonework, mostly on the arches and the columns. Those have cool gray stone, but the rest of the walls are warm. And the textures are the real rough textures of brick and stone, and the real smooth textures of glass, right on the windows, of course, and tiles. So there's no similar textures. The lines are visual, like it's visible. Of course, they're visible. Visual. They're not carved, even though this might look like it's carved. It's not. It's just the shape of the arch itself. No one took a hammer and chisel and carved that. So there's no carved line visible in this slide. So they're visual lines around the arches and the corners of the building. And those are created by the sun. The shadows or modeling is natural shadows from the sun. There's no technique for modeling. The largest mass, it should be obvious, it's the tower. And then it is the nave. Now I'm going to say you probably should write that word, and we'll define it with the very next slide. That is an important slide, a must know, of the interior of a Romanesque church. So just say the long, narrow aisle, or if you want to shorten that, it's one word, 4 letters, nave, N-A-V-E, which is the main aisle. So that would be the second largest mass. In fact, in the view I showed you, I don't want to go all the way back to those slides, way back at the beginning here, that I showed you from the air up above, you could see that long, narrow aisle, which is called the nave. So that'd be the second largest mass after the tower first. And then it would be the cross aisles. The right word for that, if you want to know, is transept. I will mention that word more often next week when we do Gothic architecture, because then it's kind of important to know, the different parts of the church. But for now, I'll just say that the different aisles, a long, narrow aisle or middle aisle, what we want to say is the second largest mass, and then the third largest is this where my arrow is pointing, the cross section, or to be correct, it's transept with an EPT at the end. And that would be the second largest. Okay, then we have the rhythm of the, of course, rounded arches and the apses and the columns. And then we have its dynamic on the tower, but on around the edges of the columns and the edges of the arches, that's stable. The spire, of course, is dynamic, and the apses are dynamic. So it's both the outer walls and the corners of the building. Of course, like most architecture, it's a mixture. Those are all stable. And then we have, let's see, modeling, textures, forgetting color, rhythm. Yeah, I already said it's balanced. Space, I think we've covered everything. Yeah, I believe we have. All right. Not a must know. I just show it to you to show you a close up. This is in a town where I had a railroad stop, a short, not a layover, just a short half-hour rest stop. And I got out to look at this. These are Romanesque arches in very prominent. You see that how ornate they can get and how heavy and thick. But they, again, here they're not, this is not a cathedral. It's not big enough, right? Or important enough. No bishop ever presided here. But it's a pretty important church in that town. It's probably their most important church in some small town in France. And you can see the short stubby columns, especially here, right? Look at that. I mean, they're almost as tall as they are wide. I mean, they're barely as, I meant to say barely as tall as they are wide. So those are classic Romanesque features on a smaller church, just to make the point that the Romanesque style was not only limited to cathedrals, it was also used on all kinds of, not only churches too. So in fact, it's still being used in some places for all kinds of churches, large or small, whether or not they're cathedral, but also on private homes. Not much in California because it's always made out of breaker stone, and we know why that's not safe in California. Certainly in the Bay Area. But if you go back east to where I was born and raised, Chicago, or any cities in the Midwest or the East Coast, you'll see Romanesque style stone houses. And they have the same features without the tall towers usually. And then, of course, they also could be used for castles and other public buildings, fortresses, castles, town halls, even in many medieval cities. So the style was not just limited to churches, but of course, if it was a town hall or a fortress, they might add the tower instead of, for religious purposes. We just described that, of course, the symbolism for the towers on a cathedral, but on a building in a town hall or a fortress, that would be for defensive purposes, of course, to be able to see an enemy who's approaching. So you see those all over Europe and some parts of the East Coast. Not train stations on the East Coast are Romanesque style. Okay, the next must know is this one. And I also won't cut this slide. I'm not saying it's 50-50, then it'll be on the test, but I won't cut it for the study list. So you do want to know about it and study it for the final. This is the nave of Saint Etienne at Caen. I know it's multiple French words. I'll spell them. The word nave is not French, though. I think it's Latin. N-A-V-E. You'll get that definition in a minute. It means the central aisle, but there's more to it than that. So the nave of Saint, remember, it's always abbreviated, at least everywhere in the syllabus. I think it's ST period. Okay. And then Etienne, it's a French first name. E-T-I-E-N-N-E at Caen, C-A-E-N. It's a city in France. Actually, there's two Caens. The southern one in the south of France is where the French Academy Awards are held. They call them a Caen Festival, and it's their version of Academy Awards. Caen, C-A-E-N. Again, nave of Saint Etienne at Caen, location France, of course, and the date is 1133. So here we go. Nave. This definition is, again, not too long. It's an important one. Almost certainly will come up on the final. N-A-V-E. Well, I shouldn't have to spell it again. This is on the top of the next page of your list of terms. The nave is the long central aisle of a Christian church, comma, the long central aisle of a Christian church, comma, within which the worshipers sit facing the altar. ALTAR. Again, within which the worshipers sit facing the altar. Well, this is the nave. And it goes, as you can tell from, if you look close, well, let's get it. There's the altar where the priest would conduct the church service. If it's a cathedral, it would be the bishop. Well, sometimes the bishop was traveling, was in Rome, but if the bishop was in town, he would give the sermon. If not, they would be, a priest. So the priest or bishop would stand, here, right in front of the altar, and everyone would be facing him, so they supposedly could hear everything he said. Now, if you're wondering, oh, wow, they had wooden folding chairs in the Middle Ages. Of course not. Those are modern chairs that would no way anything like that would have been present. So what did they have? Nothing, just the floor. There was no permanent seating in these churches in the Middle Ages. Sorry, my throat is getting a little scratchy. Give me just about 10 seconds. In other words, these are modern, seats brought in by the current bishop, I guess. And that is no relationship, in other words, to the original accommodations where you bring your own seating, literally. Now, you wouldn't probably lug a heavy wooden chair all the way from your home if you're a peasant. Why would you do that? You might bring, if you had a pillow, if you were lucky, possibly a mattress. Most people slept, the poor people slept on hay, but some of them had beds with mattresses. So you might bring a mattress or a cushion or a bale of hay, where you could fit, maybe if you had, 2 or 3 strong male members of your family carry that, then you could, several people, maybe your whole family could sit on that, and then you removed it. So that's how the seating was. It was temporary, and it was provided by the worshipers. There was no permanent seating, except for the nobles, of course. The wealthy, near the front of the church, they had permanent pews, wooden pews, reserved for them, of course. All right, and then here's your Romanesque, all 3 of the features that I held up in that diagram. Here's your concentric rounded arches all the way up. Here's your short stubby columns, even down on the first floor, though they're taller proportionately than the stubbier ones above them. They're still nowhere near the proportion of a Greek or Roman temple with 50 and 60-foot tall columns. These are maybe, possibly 12 feet, right? Or even 15, not even, probably 12. And then we have the Romanesque groined vaulting. And so let's now take a look. I think if I do it this way, yes, you'll see here, that is a Romanesque rounded, right, shape arch. All Romanesque arches are rounded by definition, not pointed, all right, or multifaceted. All Romanesque arches. That much is why they call it Romanesque, by the way. Is yes, that idea, Roman buildings, we all know, we saw those for the midterm. They use rounded arches. So that's something they were familiar with even after the fall of Rome. But now they've done something different with them. These are different rounded arches that intersect. That's called the groin right there, where they meet on the ceiling. And that's super strong, very powerfully, supportive. Or in other words, another way to say it is because of these multiple rounded arches intersecting, or the right word really, you could say meeting, every so many feet, you see that along the ceiling, you have a much stronger support system, so that the towers above this church could be supported, much taller towers. And so that's what's meant. And when you look at it, you should be able to recognize, in case the slide is on the essay part of the final, that's what's meant by the phrase Romanesque groined, because that is the groin where they meet, groined vaulting. You could say vaulted ceiling, but it by definition means ceiling. And if it's not quite clear, here's that same church. This is what it looks like on the outside. These towers are immense. They're massive and heavy, as is the roof itself. And of course, even the walls of the church are somewhat stabilized and supported to a certain degree by those groin vaults. This is that same church from the outside. It's not a must know. I used to have it on the list, but we already have enough exterior views of Romanesque churches. So I'm going to keep the list short, but just so you can see, we were just looking at the inside, this aisle here. And here's your Romanesque rounded arches, right? Concentric arches. and you're relatively short, again, proportionately short, stubby columns here, especially notice on the tower. And these massive towers, these are about 250 feet tall. Okay, so let's go back to the slide that is the must know. And that's pretty much the whole meaning, right? What I just told you. So now we'll do a formal analysis. This is a symmetrical space here. A nave is usually several hundred feet long. But it's bad in all churches that I've ever seen, certainly all Catholic churches, and definitely medieval churches. The nave is going to be balanced, completely symmetrical left to right. Now, is it balanced top to bottom? You be the judge. I would say no, because the floor is flat and the ceiling has all these built up arches. And so I'd say it's weighted toward the ceiling. But other people, and that could include you if you feel this way, would say, no, wait a minute. The floor is the largest mass because it's wider. That's the ceiling. But the floor goes all the way out onto the side aisles. Every nave has side aisles. Without them, you can't get to your seat, right? Without going through the middle of the church. So that's what these aisles on either side of a nave, there's always literally the word is side aisles, or you could just say aisles. And those have, right, the same floor. It goes all the way out to the wall. So if you think of that as because it's wider, the floor is the largest mass, I wouldn't argue. Then you could say that it's weighted toward the bottom. But to me, it is definitely symmetrical, balanced left to right, no question. But top to bottom, you be the judge. But to me, the ceiling is a heavier mass because of all that extra arching and stonework. So I'd say it's weighted unbalanced toward the top, toward the ceiling. All right, but then there's no disputing on the other features. We've got no painted line here and very little carved line. You can't see in this photo. If it's on the exam, I'm not going to have a close-up of it. So you just say visual line is around the arches here, including on the ceiling. That creates visual line. Then we have the textures or the real rough texture of stone on the walls, and it's actually brick. Well, actually stucco over brick. Yeah, this church has been restored since the first slides I used to use over 20 years ago. The ceiling still looked like the original brick. And for whatever reason, maybe that was leaking. They put stucco. So it's real smooth stucco, the texture of the ceiling. And then real smooth tile on the floor and real rough stone. You can't really see the windows here. Of course, there's the rhythm of the repeated shapes of the arches, the columns, and the groin vaulting. Lots of rhythm. It's stable on the walls themselves and the columns, and obviously dynamic on the arches and the vaulted ceiling. The modeling is just the natural shadows from the sun, of course. And for space, it's one long, narrow aisle, several hundred feet long. So just a long, narrow aisle, several hundred feet long, and about, it's less than 80, so say a little over 70 feet tall. Not very tall for naves. Naves are often 100 and even well over 100 feet. So this is about 70 feet. I think it's slightly less. The ceiling. So that's the only two dimensions you need to mention. The colors, cool everywhere. Cool gray on the stone of the walls and a cool light blue on the stucco on the ceiling. And of course, again, the growing vaulting, that's cool gray stone. And then finally the floor is a mixture of light and darker blue. Obviously, both those colors are cool on the floor tiles. Remember, the seats are not part of this building, not part of the original. And then let's see, the largest mass, I think I mentioned there, the rhythm, right? Line, am I forgetting anything here? Color, texture, I think we covered it all. Yeah, hang on, just let me take another little bit of water here. All right. If I had to tell you in this half of this lecture tonight, which of the remaining slides of this whole second half is the most likely to appear on the final, I would say it's this one. I know I'm getting perilously close to giving away what might or might not be on the final, but I think it's only fair to, you know, because I usually give you some kind of a clue as to which ones are the most likely or more likely than the others. Obviously, I'm not cutting it from the study list by by definition. A, and B, it has a very high, I will say, probability, but not certainty of being on the final. Okay, why? Because it's such a famous and unique site. But it's classic example, this three separate structures, they're all part of the same site. Classic examples, all three of these structures, of a Romanesque style church architecture. So what is the title here? Cathedral complex at Pisa. Cathedral complex, it always means a group of buildings that are, used together. Cathedral complex at Pisa. And remember, that's P-I-S-A, not P-I-Z-Z-A. Okay, and then we have Italy. That should be obvious at Pisa City in Italy, but if you didn't know, of course, now you do. 1350. Well, now this is where I do have a small bone to pick with Stockstead. Not her personally, she's moved on to the great textbook writing. Room in the Sky. She died like 3 years ago. I respect her. I've seen her interviewed and watched some documentaries where she's cited, and she is, was a major source for. So it's a good textbook. That's why we adopted it. But every so often she'll use a date or a title that's just not the same as what everyone else does, and it can be confusing or misleading. If you were to research this on the internet, you'd notice that they don't give anything close to 1350 as the date, because all these buildings were built finished decades earlier. So why does she use that date? I'll keep it because it's what's in the textbook. If you use the textbook to create flashcards or just to study from, or keep it open and flip through it, and when you're taking the test, that's your business. You'd see she uses that date, unless the new edition, I don't have those ones changed. Why does she say 1350 when it's clearly much later than these buildings really are? Because in the middle 1300s, a later bishop came along and added these Gothic points. That's it. That's the only part of any of these buildings that is anywhere near that late. In other words, all the other details, the buildings and all the decorations on all three of these buildings, and we'll say what those three buildings are in just a moment, were finished in the late 1100s. Or the other way to say it is the late 12th century. They were all built during the Romanesque era in Romanesque style. When you say complex, I said a moment ago, that means a group of buildings that were used together or for the same purpose. So maybe it's obvious, but if not, you definitely want to write that. The middle building, the largest, is the Cathedral of Pisa. And then we have the Leaning Tower. Yes, it is the Leaning Tower of, again, P-I-S-A, not the food item. And it's their bell tower, the Cathedral Bell Tower. And some of you know the word for that. If you've been to UC Berkeley, which if you come on a walking tour, you're going to see them, not right up close, but we won't be too far away from the one bell tower at the UC Berkeley campus. And they just call it the Campanile. That's the word in Italian for bell tower. So this is the bell tower, the church bell tower, or Campanile. And then this is, I used to put this in as a separate definition, but I think I took it off to give you guys a break. Yeah, it's not a standalone definition, so it won't appear on the true false section, but it's called the Baptistry. That's B-A-P-I-S-T-R-Y. Baptistry. What is that? That is a separate building, usually in front. It is not a definition. I'm just telling you for this slide, the reason that is, called the Baptistry. It's a separate building in front of a church. A Catholic church. Well, I think some English ones do too, but mostly back then they were all Catholics. So you could just say a separate building in front of a church, which was used for baptisms. Quite literally, it's the building used to baptize, babies. Usually, dunking a baby in water. That's what my uncles called baptism. If you choose, parents, choose to do that. Sometimes people get baptized in their 80s or something. It's whenever, you happen to think you want to become baptized. You can go to a church and ask to go inside the baptistry, right? And that's what that is. And that's the only building where something was added in the 1300s, these, I'll call them, arches, these Gothic arches. But everything else is Romanesque. So now let's define, remember what is part of the meaning is always what style of building is when it comes to architecture. And there's just no question that this is a Romanesque style building. Look at these concentric rounded arches, especially visible of the doors. And here all the columns are short and stubby. And then we have the last new term for tonight. What is that? I think Stockstead also, I disagree with her on this. I'm pretty sure she calls that a dome. Nope, that's not a dome. This is a dome. A dome spans the entire space below it of that room, like the one at the US Capitol building, the City Hall in San Francisco, and of course, many churches, right? Or even the State Capitol building in Sacramento. So that's not a dome. So what is it? It's a cupola. That's a short, in this case, as late as it is, I'm sure you'll be glad to share. It's a one-line definition, but it is something that could appear on the final. So you need to have it in your notes, and I'll say it once and repeat it slowly a second time. Cupola is a small room resting on top of a roof or dome. So you get the idea why it can't be a dome. There are cupolas on top of domes all over Europe and Latin America and the United States. So I'll say it again. A cupola is a small room resting on top of a roof, which it does, the roof of the nave, or a dome. So you can have an actual dome if this had a separate, right, base and windows. Most cupolas have windows. They don't have to, but most do. You could call that a cupola, but some people would still say that's a cupola. But you see what it is? It's on top of a much wider, much larger open space. The ceiling is, of course, curved upwards, and that's what a dome, by definition, is. It covers the space below it. So this is not a dome. So if it's on an exam, then you write about it. Don't make that mistake. It's a cupola. This is a dome. Okay, and then we have the tower. This is one of the most interesting facts about the meaning of this slide. It's leaning in this slide so far that if it had been allowed to continue leaning, it would have collapsed. This is an old slide. Oh, be at least 30 years old. It's before 2000. So why is that important? Because in the 1990s, or you could say a few years or several years before 2000, the government of Italy decided to create a project. There we go. They created a project to partially, and I would underline the word partially, pull the Leaning Tower upright. They pulled it halfway between where it was leaning and being upright. Well, why didn't they just finish the job? I'm going to guess there are two logical reasons why they did not want to pull the tower upright totally. I think you can guess one of them. What is Pisa known for? The town? Well,
Airports?
yeah,
For,
yeah, tourism. I think you got the idea, right? Their income depends on
Etna,
tourism.
right?
Yeah, there's no other reason to go to Pisa. The food is okay, it's not bad, but that's not that. I mean, there are plenty of other Italian cities with a lot more history and architectural legacy and great museums, you know, and paintings. None of that's here. The only thing famous in Pisa for people outside Italy is this complex, and particularly the tower. So in other words, the reason, one of the two reasons that they didn't pull the tower upright all the way is it would have destroyed their tourism industry. They needed to keep it partially leaning for their income, you could say, from the tourists that visit, because how famous. Now, the other reason is more practical or even structural. I'll give you a clue. Anybody guess? Somebody there, I think, started to say something. What might have happened if they had pulled it all the way upright?
like the can lean the other way.
Oh, that's interesting. No one said that. I suppose that's possible. I had never thought of it that way. Well, something that could happen while they're pulling the tower, I should say it was done with these very heavy metal cables and very powerful, you know, I don't know what kind of machines, trucks, I suppose, what else would it be? And they were pulling it, as you could imagine, with these cables attached to the building this way. from the whatever trucks or machines were on the ground. It might have been just machines, winches, which then just very slow. So what could have happened? It's just let's just say, other than it tilting all the way, if they kept pulling it past halfway, what would be the danger or risk to it? What might have happened? They're pulling on an old stone tower, several hundred years old.
Would destroy it too.
Yeah, you said it. There we go. Very good. They could have destroyed the tower because it could have cracked and collapsed. So engineers, luckily smart ones, told them, don't do that. Well, they wouldn't have anyway, because they didn't want to ruin their own tourism industry. So both for economic reasons, meaning maintaining their tourist income, A, and B, practical or structural reasons, they didn't dare pull it all the way either for that reason either, because it could have caused a collapse. The tower could have cracked and collapsed. So that's the story of why the tower is now about halfway. Now I have another view, and let me show it to you, but it doesn't show the baptistry, but you can see how this is an early, see how far it was leaning. Oh, there is one more fact about the meaning before we do the formal analysis. And which is that the tower is leaning, or was, just say the tower started, there we go, started leaning for a reason that has to do with not the tower itself. Well, I doubt anyone will guess this, unless you guys, any of you have ever taken, I don't know, engineering or physics or geology. I don't know if anybody's getting, what could have caused, in other words, let me rephrase my question, sorry. What possible conditions could have caused the tower to start leaning like that?
Like over
An
time.
earthquake?
Sorry, go ahead. There's two people, one at a time. Go ahead. Yes?
Well,
Oh,
neither one.
I said an
neither one-
earthquake.
Oh, well, that's a good guess. They have them all over Italy.
I was thinking like over time, like the land moves.
Yes, excellent. You said it perfectly. Yeah, everybody hear that? I'll say it in a single phrase, which is the ground settled beneath it. It was soft earth. They didn't plan it, in other words, carefully. They put it over probably an underground stream. Doesn't matter. I don't know that much about it, but I do know the ground settled. The word is settling, and we're not talking about a legal settlement or marrying someone that you're not really quite in love with. Not that kind of settling. The ground itself settled. That's the right word engineers use. See, don't write this. When I was a real estate agent in the Berkeley Hills, and I had, to write an offer on a house for someone, if there was any tilting or settling of the floors, oh yeah, either the person would have the right to back out of the deal, or at least they should get an inspection by an engineer and tell them what's causing it. Well, we don't have to guess. I'll say it again. The final fact about the meeting is the reason the tower started leaning almost immediately after it was finished is because the ground underneath it was soft, and therefore the ground itself started settling and the tower began to sink. There's one called the Millennial Tower, don't write this again, in San Francisco that's almost 2 feet off of center, tilting 2 feet out of alignment. And it's a brand new skyscraper in downtown. I think it's the second tallest building in the city. It's like 700 feet or something, with these, multi-million-dollar condos, and all these rich people moved in. Now they have to, use roller skates to get up and then out. It's a scandal, a disaster. Massive lawsuits are being filed. It's in the news every so often. They don't know how to stop it. So it happens to modern buildings too. But back in the Middle Ages, they just weren't that careful. Okay, so it's settling, and if it was not placed on infirm or unstable ground, it would never have done that, because it's not the building itself, it's not the foundation, it's not the architecture or the engineering, it's the ground, it's the geology, the earth underneath it. All right, plenty of information on the meaning, so let's do formal analysis. All of the stonework is cool white, isn't it? And so those are cool colors, but actually the roofs have slightly different. On the cathedral, you've got the cool kind of light, almost light blue, very bluish gray, very light blue gray color, which is of course cool. But the only warm colors is the red clay tile on the roof, or you could say the dome of the baptistry. Everything else is cool. The rhythm, it should be obvious, with the rounded arches, the columns, the doors and windows on all, well, actually, all three buildings have, here, the windows are only on the top levels here. Let's go up closer to this. Those are windows and that's one window or doorway, actually it's a doorway. So there are doors and windows at the top and bottom of the tower. And obviously not only the arches and columns on all three structures, but also the doors and windows all create very strong rhythm. And then it's stable on the sides of the cathedral walls, and the columns dynamic, of course, on the arches and the doorways. And this, remember, it's a cupola, not a dome. The tower, well, the tower itself is not stable for obvious reasons. The ground underneath it isn't, but because it's leaning to one side, people assume that the whole thing is dynamic, but not quite, because those columns are all straight upright. So it's mostly dynamic in that it's shaped round, of course, and the windows and arches are curved. So it's more dynamic and stable, but there are stable details. Also, the tower leaning is a diagonal angle, and it still leans so half as much as this. So the actual overall position of it is dynamic. With the baptistry, the whole thing is dynamic. There's really the only thing stable are the columns, and even on the arches above the newer arches, it's the building itself is totally, the baptistry is totally dynamic. The largest mass of the three is the cathedral. And then it's a close call, but because the tower is taller than it looks here, in fact, let's take a look and you'll see it's actually quite a bit taller than the cathedral, the cupola. I think this slide gives you some more hint, but I want to use this one because you see all three structures if it's on the test. So you could just say that the second largest mass, it's probably the tower, yeah, because it's so much taller. The baptistry, by the way, is not as tall. It's a distortion. You don't have to write this, but just for your own information, the height of the top of the dome here on the baptistry is not as tall as the finial. That's called the finial, the decoration at the top of something. The very peak of the cupola is actually taller, although it looks like it's a few feet shorter. It's actually taller. This is the kind of photo lens that was used back before digital camera. This is an old slide, obviously. So it's a distortion that makes the baptistry look bigger. So the baptistry is the third largest. Once again, the three masses in order are the largest is the cathedral, then the bell tower, and then the baptistry. For space, the cathedral has about a 90-foot high nave or ceiling, or just say ceiling, what's in the nave, and then about 110 feet, about another 20 feet tall, to the top of the cupola, the inside of the cupola. Maybe another 5 feet for the finial, so a little over 120 feet. The tower is about 145, or say a little under 150. It's not quite 100, it's 145, 48 feet. So say just short of, or slightly shorter than 150 feet. So it's the tallest structure. And then the baptistry, actually the ceiling here is only about 70 feet. The peak of this dome. And so those are the real spaces. Then obviously the rhythm, I already mentioned that. Let's see, the modeling is the shadows from the sun. The textures, the real rough texture of stone on the baptistry, real smooth marble, and that is marble. You can see it in this view. Oops. That's marble, the walls of the cathedral. Most Italian cathedrals, because marble's so plentiful in Italy, as you may know, it's everywhere in every mountain range, practically all over Italy. So it's a very mountainous country, if you didn't know that. So the smooth, real texture of marble is what the cathedral's made out of. But the two other buildings are real rough texture of stone. And then a real smooth texture of glass in all the windows, and of course, real smooth tile on the roofs of the cathedral and the baptistry. The line here is all visual line around the edges, right? And between the arches. And that's all created by the natural modeling of the sun, the sunlight itself. And let's see, am I missing something? Oh, balanced, each structure is symmetrical. Yeah, if you drew a line down the middle of the baptistry, it's totally symmetrical left to right, but you would have to say it's weighted, of course, somewhat to the bottom. Same thing with the cathedral. If you drew a line down the middle of the nave, remember these are the arms, or some people call it crossing, but the right word is transit. of the belt. It goes out the same length on the other side. So it's symmetrical left to right, and therefore balanced left to right. But obviously it's wider at the bottom as you go down. So it's unbalanced toward the bottom. And then the bell tower, bad pun. The bell tower is actually balanced, even though it doesn't look like it's balanced. It's visually balanced, not structurally, of course. And that would be, again, totally symmetrical, as almost all Italian bell towers are, including the one, the Renaissance Italian style bell tower at UC Berkeley, that's called the Cabinet. That's very symmetrical, left to right. Maybe you could say, but to me, that's not that much narrower. And if you draw the line down here, the mass is pretty much equal. I'd say it's roughly balanced top to bottom as well. Okay, I think the way we're going, it looks good, but let us see after we finish this slide, if we're already at 9:16 or 17 or 18, what we'll call it a night, and I'll cut the last slide. But let's just see, because this is a slide that I probably won't cut from the study list. But I'm not saying it has as high a probability of being on the exam as that last slide or as the Bayeux tapestry. Those are the two most important slides from tonight. Well, that all three, that first cover, if you want to mark them somehow in ascending order of how important and how more or less likely they are being on the exam, I would put the most, obvious marking for potentially highest possibilities of being on the exam on the three slides of the first cover from Sutton Hoo, the Bayeux tapestry, and the cathedral complex at Pisa. Now we're on, I must know that again, though I won't cut it from the study list, so I'll keep your notes handy for this, for the final. Mission of the Apostles from Vézelay. Mission, of course, is always has two S's. The Apostles, that's Apostles, from, and then Vézelay, capital V-E, it's a city in France, Vezelay. Again, Mission of the Apostles from Vézelay. The location, the country France, and the date is 1150. So this is Romanesque sculpture, and there's a significant difference between the features of Romanesque sculpture and Romanesque architecture. So how do you recognize Romanesque sculpture, that style of sculpture? Well, there are two main features. Let's see if anybody noticed something about the legs and even the hands or hands and fingers of Jesus. Well, this is a scene, I should start by saying what the scene is, sorry. This is a scene carved in bas relief, of course, above the main entrance. It's not a cathedral, to a church, a Romanesque style church. Obviously, it's in France, which shows Jesus up in heaven, right? There he is on the throne of heaven, it's called, or his throne in heaven. And he's ordering, or you could say directing, however you want to say, his apostles. That's his word of disciple, apostle, they're synonymous. So his followers down on earth, the ones that, still alive after he was executed, right? So he's gone up to heaven and he's telling them to go spread the word of that religion that he, now famous for, Christianity, even though he never said that while he was alive. He never claimed he was starting a new religion. That was his followers. So they're going out down on earth with Bibles in their hands. Never mind that the Bible wasn't written for hundreds of years. Well, some people say 100 years, but decades after Jesus died. So somehow, while his apostles were alive, all they had was verbal statements, sermons, lectures, meetings to spread the word. But here in this image, they got the Bible in their hand. You can see that, each carrying completed Bibles, though they weren't completed for decades after this, even generations after this period. But while they were alive, according to this scene, they went out and spread the word of God. That's what's their mission. They're spreading the word of Jesus, of this new religion of Christianity. Okay, but what's unusual about this, and one of the two ways that you can tell that it's Romanesque style, is look at his legs and the shape of his legs. What do you notice about it? Yeah, something unusual.
The proportions are
Excellent. Yes, you said it again. Kudos. You hit the nail on the head. It's exactly the point I was going to make, which is this is not normal human proportions unless there's something wrong, which some people might end up with that kind of long, narrow, and the right word, one word, a phrase is elongated, one word with an E. To be extra long and narrow, is not normal unless there's some kind of odd birth condition, right? So for normal people, certainly everything we knew about Jesus, there was actual people that wrote about who he was while he was alive. We have some idea. But anyway, he didn't have elongated limbs. We know that. So his legs are elongated, right? Long and narrow, unnaturally long and narrow, as is his head, if you look closely, and his arms and hands, especially this hand. Now, you might have noticed, we're going to get to this in the very last thing about the meaning. Why is he missing one hand? Why are these apostles or disciples missing their heads? Well, we'll get to that. It has to do with vandalism, but don't write that right now. That'll be the last fact I'll tell you before we do the formal analysis. So just say that when it was intact, all of his limbs, right? The limbs, his arms, hands, feet, and legs, were elongated. That's a sign of the Romanesque style. They did that for some reason that no one can discern or figure out. Why did they do that? Just to look different or just to be distinctive? But there's another feature that these figures, all the ones, including the disciples, by the way, they also have somewhat elongated. See this guy's leg here? If he was to stand upright, he'd be about 2/3 leg, which is, again, not normal, natural human proportions. So the elongated limbs apply to all the major figures of I'll say it again, all the main figures in Romanesque sculpture have elongated limbs, extra long and narrow arms, legs, hands, and even feet. Okay. So that's one feature. The second one has to do with their bodies and the position or posing of their bodies. What do you notice about these? If you look over here, or even the way Jesus's legs are compared to a normal portrait of someone sitting on a throne, right, facing us, and how their body would be positioned compared to that. What's unusual about the way he's posed here, or even these two guys, especially this one here next to him, down on earth, the way his legs are posed. It's not as quite as obvious as the elongated limbs, but it has something to do with the way they're posed. It looks as though they're doing something. Yeah. What would you describe that? Yeah. Somebody there?
I would say like unnatural to sit that way. Like
Yeah, it is. And what could that? Yeah, that's absolutely true. So it has something to do with the activities of their bodies. Their bodies are, well, let's get late. So they're in motion. They're moving. They almost look like they're dancing. And Jesus, even, I've had some students write papers on this very work of art because it's one of the most famous pieces of Romanesque sculpture. It almost looks like Jesus is kind of moving, if not dancing, while sitting on his throne in tune to music. Well, there's almost certainly something going on here with this. Well, what is that? Is it rays of divine energy? Probably that's what the artist intended, coming down from heaven through Jesus's fingertips into the brains of his disciples, of his followers. But there's another theory. It's music, heavenly or divine music, coming from heaven down to earth and making these men, these disciples, go out and spread the word, do their mission to, convert more people to this new religion. So they're literally dancing with this pent-up energy, is how some architectural historians would describe this, or historians, art historians. In other words, I'll say it again in one sense, that the second feature of Romanesque sculpture that marks it as different than any other style of sculpture before or since is that the main figures are in motion and they appear to be moving even as they're sitting or standing, as though they were even dancing, or full of energy and life. They are not at all the same, as you'll see next week, the static and stable and even lifeless poses of Gothic sculpture, which came after this. So the later period, the last Middle Age, is called Gothic. We'll study that in the next couple of weeks. Those sculptures don't have the motion, the energy, the movement of a Romanesque sculptural figure. All the main figures, again, second feature of Romanesque sculpture is that the main figures appear to be moving or in motion, and therefore very dynamic, very lively, as though they were even almost dancing. And that's no accident, or just this one sculptor thought of that. All the Romanesque style figures I've ever seen, on churches at least, have that feature. But there's something else going on up here. Some of you already may have noticed. Let's see, we've got a crab, we've got twins, We've got, let's see, a fish, a mermaid. Anybody guess what these symbols are? What they come from? Something people still find interesting. Yeah, go ahead. Somebody started to say it. Something that's popular enough that newspapers almost every day print something about these symbols. And there are 12 of them. Okay. Nobody can, yeah.
Creation or like the zodiac
Yes,
or something.
the zodiac, symbols of the zodiac. That's what is not supposed to be on a Christian church, because that is pagan. In other words, to cut to the chase, that these symbols of the zodiac are found on many Romanesque style, or you could even say in general, not just Romanesque, but medieval churches, okay, Christian churches. Because why? Because the architects, the bishops, the people who designed them, were admitting or acknowledging that many people still believed in the old pagan religions. So they're saying, okay, if you want to worship, your pagan gods and believe in magic and astrology when you're at home, we understand you'll do that. But when you come inside this building, you're going to believe in this guy here and the Bible, and you're going to listen to us tell you that. So in other words, it's an acknowledgement of the fact that paganism wasn't entirely dead. After all, most of you know this, don't have to write this part.
Or maybe also, sorry.
No,
It could
go
be
ahead.
also like to convince the people to convert, like to
Yeah, no, sure. That's actually,
not to convert, but to
yeah.
I don't know how to explain it.
No, that's a good way to put it. I don't think anyone else has quite ever put it just that way, but a point of comparison would be, yes, part of the process of going into a church like this, because these people didn't abandon all their old beliefs from generations back. Their ancestors for thousands of years had believed in the power of the planets and the old gods, and so the Catholic Church couldn't deny that was still influencing their own.
It's like even now today's how they say that the Virgin of Guadalupe it's presented as brunette,
yeah,
so people can feel like
I
identified.
know what you mean. Yeah. Well, how about Christmas? Christmas is a modern, not modern, more recent, Christian a version of a pagan holiday, the winter solstice. Yeah. So the tree, the Christmas tree, that doesn't have anything to do with the Bible or Jesus or Christianity per se, but it's become a symbol of the main Christian holiday, just because it's accommodating, as you're saying, right? Exactly, that there's some similarities or even comparisons, and so they're kind of saying, well, let's not fight. The people who designed this detail here, this sculpture panel, this bas-relief panel, of course, was saying, well, we got to admit that they still believe in some of these old things. So why don't we just go ahead and acknowledge that right up front on the actual architectural detailing of the church? And that's even true of these figures. These are creepy. Look at these sort of naked human figures. Kind of looks like they're having a conversation in hell with, either crocodile or wolf, or I don't know what, some kind of a animal head, so part human, part animal. Again, that's some kind of mythological pre-Christian or pagan. It's a word. Remember, I told you that word would come in handy at some point on the final. Pagan. Pagan beliefs were symbolized both by the signs of the zodiac at the top and by the mythical half human, half animal creatures in the second row. But you can see it's a Romanesque style because there's your concentric arches, right? But if it's not obvious, you should write that. Last fact about the meaning, and I think the way the timing is, I think we'll do the formal analysis, of course, full 9 elements, and then I'll stop and take questions, and we'll cut the last slide off. I'll make sure to cross it off before we call it a night. But let's finish up on the meaning with why I said, I tell you a few minutes ago, why are some parts of these bodies like Jesus's, let's see, left hand and the heads of several of his disciples missing? Well, anybody maybe who remembers more recent history, not medieval, late 1700s, France, what happened in France in the late 17 to be exact, 1789?
Or something.
Yeah, the French Revolution. The French Revolution was a period of great anger for understandable reasons. The peasants, not only them, but many of the middle class, wasn't very much of a middle class. Anybody who wasn't a noble was being oppressed by their own government, really severely repressed or oppressed. So just to summarize it in a single sentence, you could say that the vandalism that led to the damage to the figures on this sculpture panel happened during the French Revolution, when mobs would attack many French churches throughout France, not just in a couple of cities, but all over the country, and damaged many of the churches. They even burned down some whole churches because they were angry with what then was the Catholic officials siding with the nobles and the king. They rarely would the Catholic Church, I'm talking about the higher officials now. The average priest, many of the priests were with the people. You know, that's true in parts of the world today where there's a large Catholic population, where the local priest might be trying to help the poor people and the people higher up maybe aren't. But back then in France, you can just summarize it, the Catholic Church was seen as oppressing the poor by many of the peasants. So when the revolution happened, they often attacked their local Catholic church and vandalized. That's what happened here. They would take a hammer and a chisel, get up on a ladder, of course, and just chip away at some of these figures. And that's why the hand of Jesus and the heads of some of his disciples are missing. Okay, let's wrap it up with a formal analysis, and we'll end about 10 minutes early, I would say. We'll finish up with this. So is it balanced? I think it is both a top to bottom and left to right, but I have had students write papers who say, well, wait a minute, this empty space? Well, it's really the top of his throne. And then you've got these figures of these weird mythological creatures and all that above him. I think of that because of that if you do the line here, that it is balanced. But if you talk about just the human figures, they're more below the middle. And you could therefore say it's unbalanced toward the bottom. I'd leave that to you, but it's definitely balanced, roughly symmetrical, left to right, all the way, on either side. There's even amounts of figures. The largest mass, that's easy. It's Jesus. Some people would say the throne behind him, but you don't really see most of it, just the very top. So it's Jesus is the biggest mass, and then his disciples on either side are about equal. The second largest masses, pretty much all the same sizes. And then I guess it's the third largest would be the lower archway figures in the lower archway, which are the mythological half human, half animal. And the fourth largest would be the zodiac symbols. For space, we have overlapping. I don't see foreshortening here. Some people think they do, but I don't see it on Jesus's legs. They don't get narrow up here. And I certainly don't see it on the disciples. So I'd say there's no other technique on this for space except overlapping of the figures over each other, Jesus over his throne, and their robes over them, their bodies. The carved lines everywhere, it's all carved lines, create good symmetric texture on the robes, on the hair and beard of the figures, and up here on the mythological creatures and the zodiac signs. The modeling is, of course, natural sunlight, shadows, I meant to say, created by the natural sunlight. So there's no technique for modeling. Color is a cool off gray or light gray color. The real textures, and there are real textures, of course, are the rough texture of stone. This isn't marble. This is all regular stone here. So it's all rough, real stone textures. The rhythm should be obvious of the bodies, the hands, arms, legs, and even heads. Although the heads are missing on some of them, we can see that's their halo that we're looking at. Well, the halos themselves are repeated shapes. So there's plenty of rhythm here. And this is, like all Romanesque sculpture by definition, almost entirely dynamic. The only thing stable is the throne behind Jesus's head. But his body, his arms and legs, and the way his disciples are dancing around him almost, and all of these figures above him, and I would say, you don't have to describe these, but up to at least the bottom of the scene here with them is the only stable part. But all the human and mythological figures are in motion and therefore dynamic. I think I've covered everything, right? Okay. Any questions about the slides themselves before we do the stopping the lecture portion? And I'll stick around for any other kind of questions. Anybody have any other questions? Anything you need me to repeat? Okay. All right. So any questions you have now? I've already mentioned earlier that, I think one or two people joined us after we started, that if you didn't turn your paper in, I'm not going to repeat, there's only, I guess, two people. your first paper yet, you want to get that done pretty soon. And if you didn't turn your second paper in, of course, it's no more than 10 points off. Starting from today, it would be a week late. Actually, no, it was due on the 20th, so it would be 10 points off. But try to get that, or whichever, if either of your two papers haven't been turned in, try to get them done soon and turn them in so that you don't back yourself into a corner when you overload your systems when you're time to study for finals, because it's not long before final exams week. Okay, and of course extra credit options are ongoing, and I will tell you more next week about the walking tour, which will be on the 22nd. And I'll send you all an email once I pin down for sure that we're going to start with going inside that church I showed you of Bernard Maybeck's church in Berkeley as our starting point. But it's from 2 to 4:30 on Sunday, May 22nd. And it's worth 20 points extra credit. Okay, any questions about anything relating to extra credit, grades, or what we just covered?
Okay, thank you. Bye.
All right, nobody else has any questions, right? Okay, we're calling it an early evening. I'm sure we can all use the little extra time. All right, you guys have a good week. I'll see you on Monday. Take care.